There are moments in history that feel small when they happen. A man walks into a library. A storm rolls in over the sea. A name is written down in a notebook. Nothing explodes. No thunder cracks in Revelation. No choir sings. And yet something irreversible begins. In the summer of 1890, a tall, deliberate Irishman named Bram Stoker arrived in the quiet coastal town of Whitby for what was meant to be a working holiday. Whitby was not London. It did not roar with empire. It did not shimmer with ambition. It breathed. Cliffs rose above the North Sea like the ribs of something ancient. The ruins of Whitby Abbey stood broken against the skyline, skeletal and wind-worn. Below it, the churchyard of St. Mary's Church leaned toward the sea, its gravestones tilted at uneasy angles, slowly surrendering to erosion and time. It was beautiful, and it was decaying. For Stoker, this place felt like a threshold between land and sea, past and present, sacred and profane. A place where something could arrive, and something would. One local legend caught his attention more than the others. The wreck of a Russian ship that had run aground near Whitby years before. According to the townspeople, when the vessel crashed into the harbor during a violent storm, a large black dog leapt from it and vanished into the night. No one saw where it went. It simply disappeared. Stoker did what storytellers do best. He transformed it. In his imagination, the ship would not merely wreck, it would arrive with intention. The crew would be dead. The captain lashed to the wheel. The storm unnatural, guided, almost conscious. And from the broken deck, not just a dog, but a presence. A great black shape racing up the 199 steps toward the graveyard above. Already, fiction was swallowing fact. But the most important moment of that Whitby summer did not happen on the cliffs. It happened indoors, in the quiet reading room of the town's public library. At this point, Stoker was already drafting a vampire novel. The idea existed. The structure was forming. But the villain was unfinished. He bore a temporary name, Count Womper. Functional, generic, empty. The creature existed, but he did not yet have gravity. While researching Eastern European history, Stoker opened an 1820 volume titled An Account of the Principalities of Wallachia and Moldavia written by British consul William Wilkinson. It was not dramatic. It was not Gothic. It was a dry political record, and buried inside, almost carelessly, was a footnote mentioning a Wallachian ruler named Dracula. The note explained that in the local language, the name meant devil. It referenced a lineage associated with fierce leadership, warfare, and ruthless resolve. Stoker paused. He copied the word into his notebook, and then he underlined it. Dracula. The syllables felt ancient. They carried weight. Dragon, devil, blood, authority. It was not invented. It was inherited. The Count was no longer a placeholder. He had a name that echoed backward through centuries. Count Womper was abandoned almost immediately. Names matter. They anchor myth to memory. With that single discovery, the vampire gained history. And with history came danger. Whitby had given Stoker atmosphere. The abbey, the harbor, the storm, the graveyard. But the library had given him identity. Now a new question formed in his mind. Who was the man behind the name? Because before Dracula became fiction, before he stalked London in shadow, before he crept across pages in 1897, the name belonged to someone real. A prince of Wallachia, a ruler forged in violence. A man history would remember with a different title. His name was Vlad III, and history would call him Vlad the Impaler. We leave Whitby now. The sea fades behind us. The wind grows sharper. We travel backward into the 15th century, into the fault line between Christian Europe and the rising Ottoman Empire, into a world where brutality was not monstrous. It was survival. Say next part when you're ready. Long before the novel. Long before the cape and the castle and the sharpened fangs. Before the ink dried in 1897. Before London trembled in fiction. There was a boy. He was born in 1431 in the fortress town of Sighisoara, in what is now modern Romania, then part of the Kingdom of Hungary. His name was Vlad. His father was Vlad II Dracul, a member of a chivalric order known as the Order of the Dragon. a brotherhood sworn to defend Christian Europe against the expanding power of the Ottoman Empire. The title Dracula did not originally mean devil. It meant dragon, a symbol of power, vigilance, and divine warfare. But languages shift, meanings twist. Over time, dragon and devil began to overlap. And so the son of Dracula became known as Dracula, son of the dragon, or son of the devil. Wallachia, the land they ruled, was not a peaceful kingdom. It was a borderland, trapped between two massive forces. To the north and west stood the Kingdom of Hungary. To the south and east, the ever-expanding Ottoman Empire. Wallachia was not strong enough to dominate either. It survived by maneuvering, by bending without breaking, by choosing when to submit and when to resist. It was a political knife edge, and children born into such lands do not grow up gently. In 1442, when Vlad was still a boy, his father made a decision meant to secure the family survival. To prove loyalty to the Ottoman Sultan, he sent his two sons, Vlad and his younger brother Radu, to the Ottoman court as political hostages. Not prisoners exactly, but not free. They were guarantees, insurance. If their father betrayed the Sultan, the sons would pay. The boys were taken deep into Ottoman territory, into a world of unfamiliar language, customs, and discipline. There they were educated alongside noble captives and future administrators of the empire. They learned Turkish. They studied warfare, strategy, theology, court politics. They witnessed the machinery of imperial power from the inside. For young Radu, this world became almost a second home. He adapted. He learned to navigate it smoothly. But for Vlad, the experience carved something harder. Resentment, humiliation, fury contained beneath discipline. Hostage life teaches patience. It teaches silence. It teaches that survival is sometimes more important than pride, but also teaches memory. And Vlad would remember. In 1447, while Vlad and Radu were still in Ottoman custody, news reached them that their father had been overthrown and killed by rival boyars, the noble class of Wallachia, with Hungarian support. Vlad's older brother Mircea was captured and buried alive. The message was clear. Loyalty meant nothing. Alliances shifted like sand. Trust was fatal. Vlad was around 16 years old. The ground beneath his childhood disappeared in a single stroke. Eventually, the Ottomans released him, not out of mercy, but calculation. A destabilized Wallachia was useful. A prince trained in Ottoman systems could be installed as a controllable ruler. In 1448, Vlad briefly seized the Wallachian throne with Ottoman backing. It did not last. He was driven out within months. But something had changed. He had tasted power, and he intended to return. Years passed in exile. He moved through Transylvania. He negotiated. He gathered allies. He watched and waited. Then in 1456, amid shifting Hungarian-Ottoman tensions, Vlad reclaimed the throne of Wallachia, this time with Hungarian support. Now he ruled not as a hostage, not as a pawn, but as voivode, prince and war leader. And he ruled with a clarity that bordered on obsession. Wallachia had been unstable for decades, fractured by boyar conspiracies and foreign manipulation. Vlad saw internal betrayal as the root disease. So he responded not with negotiation, but with terror. One of his earliest acts was to invite many of the leading boyars to a grand Easter feast. It appeared ceremonial, traditional, a gesture of unity. During the feast, he asked them how many princes they had served. The answers varied. Some admitted to serving multiple rulers, each deposed in turn. Vlad listened. Then he ordered their arrest. The older nobles were impaled on stakes outside the city. The younger ones were forced into brutal labor, marching to rebuild his mountain fortress at Poenry. This was not random cruelty. It was calculated spectacle. Impalement became his signature punishment, a slow, public execution in which victims were mounted on tall wooden stakes and left to die over hours or days. It was agonizing. It was visible. It was unforgettable. Forests of stakes began to rise outside towns, grim warnings to enemies and traitors alike. This is why history remembers him as Vlad the Impaler. To modern ears, it sounds monstrous. To 15th century rulers on a volatile frontier, it was psychological warfare. When Ottoman forces later marched against Wallachia, they encountered something that shook even hardened soldiers. Outside Targovist, they found thousands of impaled corpses arranged in what chroniclers described as a forest. The sight, the smell, the silence. It was designed to break morale before battle even began. The Ottoman Sultan at the time, Mehmed II, was no stranger to conquest. He had captured Constantinople in 1453, reshaping the map of Europe. Yet even he reportedly hesitated at the scale of Vlad's brutality. This was not mere defense. It was theater of fear, and it worked, at least temporarily. Vlad could not permanently defeat the Ottoman Empire. Wallachia was too small, but he made invasion costly, unpredictable, psychological. His cruelty served a political function: consolidate power internally, deter enemies externally. Order through terror. But terror has a price. Over time, his alliances fractured again. Hungarian support cooled. Propaganda pamphlets circulated in German-speaking regions, exaggerating and sometimes fabricating tales of his savagery. Stories spread of banquets among the impaled, of blood rituals, of sadism without limit. Some are likely embellished. Some are likely true. Vlad was eventually captured by Hungarian forces and imprisoned for years. Later, he briefly regained the throne in 1476, and then he died in battle that same year. His head, according to some accounts, was sent to Constantinople as proof of his death. That could have been the end of it. Another brutal prince in a brutal century, forgotten among many. But history does not forget spectacle. It preserves it, distorts it, retells it. German pamphlets turned him into a cautionary tyrant. Russian chronicles portrayed him as a harsh but just defender of Christianity. In Romania, over centuries, he evolved into a complex national figure. Cruel, yes, but resistant. A shield against Ottoman domination. And then, 400 years later, a writer in Whitby found his name in a footnote. Stoker did not copy the full history. He borrowed the aura, the antiquity, the suggestion of cruelty, the whisper of devil. He fused Wallachian prince with Gothic nightmare. He stripped away context and left myth. But here's the twist. The historical Vlad did not drink blood. He was not undead. He did not sleep in coffins. Those elements came from elsewhere, from folklore that had already been haunting Eastern Europe long before Stoker ever opened that library book. Because the soil of Transylvania and Wallachia already carried stories of something that returned from the grave, something that fed, something that did not stay buried. And that is where our path goes next. From prince to peasant superstition, from political terror to rural nightmare. Say next part when you're ready. He keeps walking. The path narrows slightly, grass brushing against his shoes, small stones shifting under each step. There is no sign telling him where it leads, and no map, and no projected outcome. And strangely, that absence feels honest. The city still exists behind him, its towers, its noise, its relentless rhythm. But here the air moves differently. It does not rush. It does not demand. He realizes how long it has been since he moved without purpose assigned by someone else. Every step now is self-authorized. That thought alone feels radical. He remembers how systems promise safety, structure, order, predictability. And in return, they ask for obedience, time, attention, identity. He had given all three without noticing. The transaction had been quiet. He had signed nothing, yet everything was signed for him. Now, as the trees grow thicker around the path, the light filters through leaves and fracture patterns. It feels almost symbolic. Truth rarely arrives in full clarity. It comes in fragments that he thinks about the word success, how it was defined for him early on, how it was repeated until it sounded like destiny. Good grades, good job, good salary, good life, and no one ever paused to ask. Good for who? Good by what measure? He had chased benchmarks like checkpoints in a game designed by someone invisible, and each time he reached one, the satisfaction dissolved faster than expected. There was always another level, another upgrade, another climb. The horizon kept moving. He slows down. He listens. There are sounds. Here he cannot name precisely. A rustle. A distant bird call. The low hum of wind moving through branches. None of it is optimized. None of it is curated. And yet it feels complete. He wonders if completion was never about accumulation. Maybe it was about alignment. The thought lingers. Alignment between action and inner voice. Alignment between movement and meaning. For so long, he had been aligned with expectation. Not essence. He reaches a small clearing. Nothing dramatic. Just open space between trees. Light falls directly onto the ground here. Warmer somehow. He stands at the center of it. Not performing. Not producing. Just breathing. He inhales deeply. The air carries scent. Earth, leaves, moisture that feels raw in the best way. He realizes how filtered his life had become. Filtered light through office blinds. Filtered conversations through professional language. Filtered emotions through acceptable expression. Even his laughter had been moderated, calculated to fit rooms. He sits on the ground. The earth is firm, but not hostile. There's something grounding about direct contact. He rests his palms against the soil. IT does not react. IT does not judge. IT simply exists. And in that existence, he feels permission to do the same. Thought surfaces quietly. What if nothing is wrong with me? What if the exhaustion was not weakness, but misplacement? What if the constant restlessness was not a flaw, but a signal? He had spent years trying to fix himself, improve productivity, hack motivation, discipline his mind. He downloaded apps. He read books. He watched talks promising optimization. But none of them addressed the core question. Optimize for what? The clearing remained silent. And applause. And validation. And KPI confirming progress. And yet this feels more real than any achievement presentation he has ever given. He closes his eyes again. Not to escape, but to listen. There's a subtle tension still inside him. The old system whispering. You are wasting time. You should be doing something. This is unproductive. He recognizes that voice now. IT sounds urgent, but it is not wise. He lets it speak without obeying it. That alone feels like rebellion. Minutes pass. Or maybe longer. Time behaves differently without measurement. He opens his eyes and looks upward. Branches frame the sky like a living architecture. Steel, glass, and engineered precision. And yet, it holds together. He wonders how many structures in his life are held together only by fear. Fear of losing status. Fear of falling behind. Fear of disappointing. Others fear disguised as ambition. The clearing does not respond. IT does not need to. He stands slowly. There's more path ahead. He does not know how far it goes. But he senses this is not about distance. IT is about direction. As he steps back onto the trail, he feels something subtle but undeniable. The old identity, the efficient, the reliable, the ambitious version of himself is loosening. Not destroyed, just loosening, like armor being unbuckled after a long war. He hadn't realized he was fighting. He thought he was building, but maybe he had been defending against stillness, defending against doubt, defending against the possibility that the entire framework might be optional. The trees thin slightly as he walks, and ahead he hears something new. Water, faint at first, then clearer. A steady flow. He follows the sound instinctively. IT grows louder, more distinct, until finally he sees it. A small river, not massive, not dramatic, but undeniably alive. IT moves with quiet confidence. IT does not rush to prove itself. IT does not slow to impress. IT simply flows around obstacles. When it meets a rock, it does not argue. IT adapts. When the ground dips, it deepens. When it widens, it spreads. There is intelligence in that movement. Unforced, organic. He kneels by the edge. The water is cool when he touches IT. IT continues moving whether he is there or not. IT does not perform for observers. He watches how sunlight dances on its surface. Constant motion, never the same twice. He thinks about how rigid he has been, trying to hold shape, trying to control narrative, trying to secure outcomes. What if strength was not rigidity? What if it was adaptability? The river does not cling to previous form. It does not mourn the curve it left behind. That it moves forward without resentment. That feels like a lesson he had been avoiding. That he sits beside it, letting the sound fill space that used to be occupied by notifications and deadlines. This sound has no agenda. That IT does not try to sell him anything. That IT does not demand attention. That IT simply exists. And for the first time in a long time, he feels no pressure to become more. That he feels enough. Not in the sense of completion, but in the sense of presence, the system. Back in the city would call this stagnation, wasted potential, lost momentum. But here, by the river, momentum looks different. At IT is not upward. At IT is not competitive. At IT is continuous. He begins to understand something quietly profound. He does not need to escape the world. He needs to stop mistaking the system for the world. The world is larger than corporate ladders and curated feeds. The world includes rivers that flow without sponsorship, and forests that grow without strategy, and paths that exist. Without being mapped, he stands again. The path continues alongside the river now. Coincidence? Maybe, but it feels intentional in a way he cannot explain. That he walks with the water now, matching its rhythm unconsciously, not hurrying, not dragging, just moving. There's uncertainty ahead, but it no longer feels threatening. That IT feels open, and openness is different from emptiness. Openness invites. Emptiness drains. He had confused the two for years. He continues forward. The city behind him feels less like a foundation and more like a backdrop. And for the first time, he is not walking away in anger. He is walking toward clarity. The path curves again, out of sight, and he follows it. Not because he knows where it leads, but because he finally trusts the act of walking itself. That Stoker's Dracula, however, was more than a monster of fear. He was a mirror for human obsession, desire, and the fragile limits of understanding. Each character in the novel functions as both participant and observer, negotiating between knowledge and terror. Mina Harker embodies the Victorian ideal of rationality tempered by intuition, a bridge between the modern scientific mind and the inherited folk wisdom that Van Helsing represents. Her psychic link to Dracula is both curse and tool, showing how insight often comes at the cost of personal safety, mirroring Stoker's own anxieties about his frail health and the precariousness of human life. Jonathan Harker's journey to Transylvania and back is a literal and metaphorical passage from an ordered, familiar world into the chaotic, foreign, and ultimately transformative experience of confronting the monstrous. In the process, Stoker examines the psychological terror of isolation, the vulnerability inherent in unfamiliar spaces, and the moral responsibility of witnessing evil and acting to resist it. Through Dracula's interaction with England, Stoker presents a collision of worlds, the medieval and the modern, the foreign and the familiar, chaos and civilization. These confrontations highlight the fragility of perceived stability and the latent fears that dwell beneath the surface of Victorian society. The novel's structure, with its epistolary form, diary entries, newspaper clippings, and letters, creates a sense of immediacy and verisimilitude. Each perspective adds a layer of complexity, showing how different minds interpret and react to the same terrifying events. The fragmentation of narrative mirrors the fragmentation of understanding when faced with an unknowable force, emphasizing that knowledge alone does not confer power. It must be combined with courage, action, and moral clarity. That Stoker's attention to the material, the geographical, and the historical grounds the supernatural in a reality that his readers could recognize. The wharf at Whitby, the churchyard on the cliff, the distant forests and mountains of Transylvania all serve as anchors, reminding the audience that terror exists not only in imagination, but in the spaces we inhabit, walk through, and remember. The vampire, then, is not merely a creature of folklore. He is a lens through which Stoker explores cultural anxieties, fear of the other, the instability of social order, and the thin line between life and death, modernity and superstition, desire and destruction. That Dracula's enduring power comes from this careful synthesis. historical resonance, folkloric depth, literary inheritance, and personal fear. Stoker constructed a narrative that is simultaneously immediate and timeless, local and universal, specific and archetypal. He gave the Victorian imagination a monster that could grow with it, adapt to its fears, and persist long after the gas lamps dimmed and the empire began to fade. The Count remains, then, because he is not a simple villain. He is a prism of human concern, an embodiment of fear shaped by history, literature, folk memory, and the intimate darkness of one man's mind. Stoker's genius lay not only in creation, but in the layering of sources, insights, psychology, and narrative. Technique to forge a creature who could haunt centuries, appearing and reappearing to reflect the terrors of each new age. Dracula's immortality in culture is also a story of adaptation and reinvention. As society changes, so do the fears it projects onto the vampire. Each generation reshapes him to reflect contemporary anxieties, transforming his image, methods, and meaning in the 20th century. Cinema, radio, television, and literature took the skeletal framework Stoker built and clothed it in new aesthetics, psychologies, and horrors. Lugosi gave him hypnotic allure and elegance. Christopher Lee added raw sexuality and feral violence, and Rice and modern authors explored inner consciousness, morality, and existential suffering. The vampire becomes a vessel for exploring the liminal spaces between life and death, freedom and restraint, desire and morality, foreignness and familiarity. This adaptability is central to why Dracula has never truly died. He is a mirror whose reflection shifts with the world looking into it. His presence forces confrontation with fears both external and internal. Foreign invasion, cultural decay, erotic danger, moral corruption, biological threat, and ultimately, the fragility of human control over life and death. Stoker's narrative, though anchored in the Victorian moment, provides the structure for all these reinterpretations because it established a precise set of rules, settings, and archetypes that are flexible enough to accommodate each new cultural lens. The epistolary structure, geographical specificity, historical allusions, and folklore grounding give each adaptation a reference point, allowing creators to tweak aspects of Dracula's nature while preserving the core essence. The intersection of the seductive, the deadly, and the uncanny. This balance between specificity and malleability is a key reason Dracula persists. He is rooted enough in history, folklore, and literature to feel authentic and abstract enough to absorb the fears of every subsequent era. The myth becomes larger than its creator, more powerful than any single representation, capable of embodying the anxieties of London in 1897, of interwar Europe, of postmodernity, or even of the digital age. His narrative is cyclical: arrival, infection, terror, opposition, temporary defeat, transformation, and return. This pattern mirrors the ongoing human struggle to confront and comprehend evil, as well as our fascination with the limits of life, desire, and morality. To Stoker's Count is, then, both a product and a perpetuator of myth. A character whose existence depends not on the literal, but on the persistent resonance of fear, desire, and narrative logic. He is at once a historical echo, a folkloric revenant, and a literary creation whose power lies in the fusion of these elements. Dracula endures because he is a reflection of ourselves, our nightmares, our desires, and our unending curiosity about the darkness that exists both outside and within. That Dracula's influence extends beyond literature and film into all facets of popular culture, from theater, comics, and graphic novels, to video games, role-playing, television series, and even fashion. That he has become a symbol, an archetype, a shorthand for the darkly seductive, eternally dangerous outsider. Educators, pop culture critics, and psychologists have analyzed the vampire as a reflection of societal fears, psychosexual anxieties, and moral dilemmas, while anthropologists trace his origins to cross-cultural myths about the dead, the forbidden, and the monstrous. The endurance of Dracula also owes much to the flexibility of his narrative. He can be horror, romance, psychological thriller, or political allegory, depending on the lens through which he is interpreted. His shape-shifting nature, both literal and metaphorical, allows each generation to project its unique cultural concerns onto him, while retaining the core terror of a being who is at once human and inhuman, ancient and modern, seductive and deadly. This ongoing reinvention ensures that Dracula is never static. He evolves as society evolves, remaining perpetually relevant and frightening. More than a monster, Dracula is a cultural touchstone, a mirror reflecting the fears, desires, and uncertainties of every age that encounters him. He is a story that never ends, a myth that never dies, a shadow that follows humanity wherever it goes. In essence, Dracula is more than a character. He is a cultural phenomenon, a nexus where history, folklore, literature, and psychology converged. Stoker's genius lay in synthesizing these diverse elements into a coherent, narrative entity capable of embodying the anxieties of his era while remaining adaptable to future ones. He transforms scattered myths, historical echoes, and literary precedents into a figure whose power resides not just in fangs or supernatural abilities, but in the capacity to unsettle, enthrall, and reflect the deepest fears and desires of those who encounter him. His arrival in Whitby, the borrowing of Vlad's name, the lessons from Polidori, Lefanu, and Gerard, all coalesced into a monster both rooted in reality and liberated by imagination. Dracula is thus both a product and a mirror of human culture, demonstrating how fiction can crystallize history, folklore, and psychology into a symbol that transcends time, geography, and medium. Dracula's enduring power comes from his malleability and the universality of the fears he embodies. Stoker did not simply invent a vampire. He engineered a framework through which all subsequent stories of the undead would flow. He gave Dracula a psychological depth and cultural resonance that allowed each generation to project its anxieties onto him. For the Victorians, he was a foreign invader, an aristocrat whose lineage and manners concealed a parasitic and predatory nature, threatening the moral and racial purity of English society. His ability to infiltrate polite society reflected anxieties about immigration, urbanization, and the fragility of social order. For early 20th century audiences, film adaptations transformed Dracula into a figure of eroticized horror, the suave predator of the drawing room and the shadowed corridor, embodying fears and desires that could not be openly acknowledged in polite society. Christopher Lee's portrayal emphasized a raw, animalistic power, reminding viewers that beneath charm and civility could lie unspeakable violence. But Lugosi's Dracula crystallized the image of the aristocratic vampire, from cape to hypnotic stare, to become instantly recognizable around the world. Dracula's adaptability also allowed him to be a vessel for metaphorical storytelling. In times of disease or epidemic, he could symbolize contagion. His bite a vector for unseen and unstoppable threats that in eras concerned with the excesses of power or capitalism. He could represent the parasitic elite, extracting life and wealth from the body politic that in every incarnation. He remains a mirror, reflecting the fears, taboos, and obsessions of the society in which he appears. His immortality is thus narrative as well as supernatural. He survives because each retelling renews him, aligning his myth with the concerns of a new era. Stoker's Dracula also demonstrates the intersection of the personal and the cultural. Bram Stoker's own life, his battles with illness, his dependence on mentors, such as Henry Irving, and the shadow of societal expectations, infuses the novel with a psychological realism and emotional intensity that resonates beyond the Gothic trappings. The Count's predation, his capacity to drain both life and will, is not only a metaphor for the anxieties of late Victorian Britain, but also a reflection of the inner conflicts and obsessions of his creator. The novel becomes, therefore, a work of layered meaning, where historical fact, folklore tradition, literary precedent, and personal experience fuse to create a narrative that is both terrifying and enduring. Finally, Dracula's journey from page to stage to screen illustrates how myth is constructed and reconstructed. The novel laid the foundation, providing a detailed and coherent account of the vampire's behavior, rules, and vulnerabilities that IT gave him a social context, a historical echo, and a literary ancestry. Adaptations stripped away, emphasized, or amplified certain elements to suit different media and audiences, but the essential framework remained the Stoker's combination of the historical Vlad the Impaler, the folkloric revenants of Eastern Europe, the psychological insights of Sheridan Le Fanu, and the aristocratic vampire of Polidori created a template that was complete enough to survive multiple reinterpretations, yet open enough to allow for endless reinvention. That Dracula's myth demonstrates the power of narrative synthesis, the ability to take fragments from history, lore, literature, and personal experience, and fuse them into a figure whose meaning extends far beyond its origin. He is a monster born of research, imagination, and cultural resonance, a creature who can embody the fears of any age while remaining recognizably himself. The Count's immortality is a testament not only to Stoker's creativity, but also to the human fascination with the dark, the forbidden, and the unknown. Through Dracula, Stoker gave the world a monster who is timeless, adaptable, and profoundly resonant, a mirror in which each generation can see its own shadows, and a legacy that ensures that Bram Stoker, like his creation, will never be forgotten. That Dracula's influence on literature and popular imagination cannot be overstated. From his first appearance in Stoker's meticulously researched novel, he has served as a nexus where folklore, history, and psychology converge. Each retelling, adaptation, or reinterpretation has expanded his mythos, adding layers of nuance or spectacle, while keeping the core essence intact. This adaptability stems from Stoker's methodical approach. He built Dracula not merely as a monster, but as a complex social and psychological force capable of interacting with the modern world. Through Jonathan Harker, Mina, Van Helsing, and the others, Stoker positioned Dracula within a society governed by reason, science, and law, allowing for a narrative tension between rationality and the supernatural, a tension that continues to captivate audiences to this day. The spatial and architectural dimensions of Dracula's story are equally crucial to his enduring power. Whitby, London, Transylvania. All these settings are not mere backdrops. They're extensions of Dracula's presence, each landscape shaping and reflecting his influence. Whitby's rugged cliffs, storm-lashed harbors, and crumbling churchyards evoke a sense of ancient danger, of history pressing against the present. Transylvania's remote mountains, forests, mist, and folklore create a liminal space where the boundaries between life and death, history and myth, are blurred. London, with its crowded streets, gas lamps, and imperial anxiety, offers a stage where Dracula's invasion is simultaneously physical, social, and psychological. He does not merely cross borders. He infiltrates civilization itself, bringing the ancient and the supernatural into contact with modernity. The narrative structure Stoker chose reinforces this collision between the ancient and modern, between folklore and science. Epistolary letters, diary entries, newspaper clippings, and travelogues allow multiple perspectives, each offering fragments of truth and varying degrees of understanding. By layering these accounts, Stoker mirrors the experience of encountering the unknown. Observation is piecemeal, understanding is gradual, and danger lurks in the spaces between perception and reality. This technique also strengthens the reader's immersion, as they're compelled to assemble the story from evidence as Harker, Van Helsing, and Mina do, creating a sense of participatory discovery and suspense. That Dracula's physiological and supernatural traits are carefully calibrated to evoke both fear and fascination, while the historical Vlad the Impaler provides the template for cruelty and strategic ruthlessness. Stoker amplifies these qualities into traits that define natural limits: superhuman strength, control over animals, transformation into wolves or bats, rapid healing, an uncanny ability to hypnotize or dominate others. These abilities, grounded in Gothic imagination, intersect with a late Victorian obsession with degeneration, atavism, and the persistence of primal traits within modern society. Dracula embodies the notion that beneath the veneer of civilization lurks the potential for barbarism, and that such forces can emerge suddenly, subverting order and morality. Stoker's Dracula also operates as a study in social and sexual transgression. His interactions with women, from Lucy to Mina, illustrate anxieties about female sexuality, power, and agency in Victorian society. The vampire bite becomes both literal and metaphorical penetration, a violation that is simultaneously erotic, violent, and transformative. Like Carmela and Polydori's Lord Ruthven before him, Dracula's influence destabilizes traditional hierarchies, challenging the perceived safety of domestic and societal norms. This duality, terror and seduction, ensures that Dracula's impact extends beyond mere fright into the realm of psychological and cultural commentary. The tension between preservation and destruction is another persistent theme. Stoker repeatedly contrasts the fragile human order with the unstoppable force of the undead. Dracula's control over his own environment, his ability to command animals, weather, and the earth itself creates a sense that human civilization is not absolute, but contingent and vulnerable. This is reflected in the physical landscape. Whitby's eroding cliffs, Transylvania's isolated castles, and London's crowded, morally complex streets all suggest spaces where boundaries are porous, where the sacred, profane, and natural intermingle. Through this lens, Dracula becomes a symbolic agent of entropy, a figure whose presence exposes the fragility of human structures, both physical and societal. Dracula's influence extends far beyond the pages of Stoker's novel into the broader cultural imagination, shaping the way we conceive of horror, monstrosity, and the supernatural in literature, film, and even psychology. The figure of the vampire became a mirror for societal fears, a vessel through which anxieties about sexuality, foreignness, technology, and morality could be projected. Stoker's careful combination of historical resonance, folkloric depth, and Gothic theatricality created a blueprint for the vampire as both predator and aristocrat, a being capable of infiltrating polite society while simultaneously embodying its most terrifying possibilities. In the 20th century, Dracula's evolution accelerated as the character migrated across media. First, through theatrical adaptations in the 1920s and 1930s, he was distilled into a more manageable, performable figure. The sprawling narrative of the novel was condensed into intimate, suspenseful spectacles, emphasizing tension, psychological dread, and the charisma of the vampire himself. Bela Lugosi's iconic 1931 portrayal in Universal Studios films solidified the visual shorthand for Dracula. The dark tuxedo, the high-collared cape, the hypnotic gaze. The performance emphasized stillness, controlled menace, and aristocratic poise, creating an image of vampirism as a blend of elegance and predation. This interpretation diverged from Stoker's physical warrior prints, turning Dracula into a more psychological, seductive monster, one whose terror relied less on brute force and more on presence and suggestion. Later interpretations, notably Christopher Lee's Hammer horror films, shifted the emphasis again, bringing back the physicality and raw violence that Stoker had infused in his literary Dracula, but combining it with overt sexual energy and charisma that Lee's Dracula was unapologetically dangerous, combining aristocratic allure with monstrous appetite, his presence commanding the screen both visually and psychologically. The films amplified the erotic and gothic dimensions of the vampire, mythologizing Dracula as a creature whose power was both irresistible and terrifying. The transition from literary to cinematic vampire illustrates how adaptable Stoker's creation was, able to serve the evolving anxieties and fascinations of audiences across generations. Dracula also provided a template for exploring gender, sexuality, and power relations in ways that were remarkably progressive for the late 19th century. His interactions with female characters, Lucy, Westera, his brides, and Mina highlighted a tension between desire, domination, and autonomy. This tension was further informed by his literary predecessors, from Polydori's Lord Ruthven to Le Fanu's Carmela, who taught Stoker the intricacies of psychological vampirism, the way intimacy could be both alluring and deadly. The act of biting, of drawing life, transformed the victim both physically and socially, illustrating anxieties around contamination, consent, and the transgression of social boundaries that in Dracula. These fears are encoded in narrative and motif, linking vampirism to questions of sexuality, gendered power, and societal collapse. The Empire itself is a crucial context for understanding Dracula's cultural resonance. Stoker wrote at the height of Britain's imperial power when the nation confronted both the pride and vulnerability of its global dominance. Immigration, urbanization, and the expansion of communication and trade networks introduced new anxieties about infiltration, corruption, and moral decay. Dracula's arrival by ship, his careful integration into London society, and his ability to manipulate, hypnotize, and victimize the innocent reflect contemporary fears of foreign intrusion and the fragility of cultural and moral order. The vampire is not just a supernatural predator. He is an allegory for the perceived threats to the Empire's cohesion, health, and racialized hierarchy. Yet, Stoker's novel does not leave the reader in despair. The coalition that defeats Dracula, Van Helsing, Harker, Seward, Mina, Quincy Morris, represents rationality, science, faith, and international cooperation. Modern methods, combined with ancient knowledge and moral courage, restore balance. This resolution validates the notion that even in the face of ancient and foreign threats, the civilized world can assert control provided it unites knowledge, strategy, and ethical resolve. This duality, acknowledging fear while asserting mastery, is central to Dracula's enduring appeal, offering both horror and reassurance that Dracula's adaptability is also rooted in the universality of his archetype. He embodies primal fears, death, disease, loss of control, violation of boundaries. But he is sufficiently abstract to allow each generation to project its own anxieties onto him that in the Cold War era, Dracula could symbolize. Totalitarianism or ideological invasion in the age of pandemics and viral contagion. He became a metaphor for bloodborne disease and societal vulnerability. In contemporary interpretations, he can represent corporate predation, environmental collapse, or the seductive danger of power untempered by ethics. In each case, the vampire functions as a mirror, reflecting the dominant fears of the moment while retaining the core essence that Stoker meticulously constructed that in contemporary media, Dracula has been reinvented countless times, each iteration emphasizing different facets of his mythos in literature. And Rice's interview with the vampire and subsequent works transformed the vampire into a deeply introspective, romanticized figure, shifting focus from external threat to internal moral conflict. Rice's vampires are tragic, haunted by immortality, alienation, and ethical ambiguity, highlighting the psychological depth that Stoker only hinted at in film and television. Dracula has been reimagined across genres, from horror to romance to action, each adaptation reflecting its cultural moment. Bram Stoker's Dracula remains a template, his core traits recognizable even when superficially altered. Charisma, immortality, an aura of danger, and a predatory allure that transcends time and place. The psychological dimension of Dracula cannot be overstated. Stoker's careful construction of fear leverages not only the uncanny and grotesque, but also subtle manipulation of perception, space, and suspense. Use of letters, diaries, and multiple perspectives in the novel creates a fragmented, subjective narrative that immerses the reader in uncertainty, fear, and anticipation. This narrative technique heightens the horror, allowing Dracula's influence to seem omnipresent even when he is offstage. It also mirrors the Victorian fascination with surveillance, knowledge, and the invisible forces shaping society that in essence, Stoker created a monster whose menace is amplified by the mind of the reader, turning imagination into a participatory form of terror. Cultural adaptation also underscores Dracula's symbolic flexibility. In Japan, for example, Dracula inspired early manga and anime interpretations, blending Western Gothic tropes with local aesthetic sensibilities and folklore. In Eastern European cinema, he resonates with regional myths, linking the historical Vlad III of Wallachia to folkloric vampiric traditions that in the United States. Dracula was incorporated into Universal and Hammer horror films, as well as modern television dramas, comics, video games, and even fashion, cementing his role as an icon of popular culture. His image, cape, fangs, hypnotic gaze, functions as a visual shorthand for the mysterious, dangerous, and seductive, immediately recognizable across continents and generations. Beyond entertainment, Dracula has served as a lens through which scholars explore issues of gender, ethnicity, colonialism, and social anxiety. His predatory behavior and interactions with women illuminate Victorian notions of sexuality, consent, and the fragility of social mores. Scholars have examined the novel's implicit xenophobia, the fear of foreign intrusion and disease, and its connection to the anxieties of a rapidly changing empire. Dracula's immortality, his ability to cross borders, his secrecy, and his infiltration of domestic spaces symbolize the fear of the unknown and uncontrollable, reflecting both personal and societal concerns that Stoker's work, while Gothic and sensational, offers a remarkably rich canvas for analyzing the intersection of literature, culture, and psychology. Moreover, Dracula's persistence in global imagination attests to his archetypal power. He's at once predator and aristocrat, monster and antihero, victimizer and tragic figure. This duality enables writers, filmmakers, and artists to explore complex questions about morality, power, desire, and mortality. His myth is elastic, able to accommodate both horror and empathy, violence and seduction, fear and fascination to in every adaptation. From page to screen to digital media, Dracula challenges audiences to confront the boundaries between life and death, society and wilderness, the known and the unknowable that in education and scholarship. Dracula continues to serve as a critical tool for understanding narrative construction, genre formation, and cultural anxiety. The novel's intricate plotting, multi-perspective storytelling, rich symbolism, and Gothic conventions make it an exemplar of 19th century horror literature. Yet its influence extends beyond literature, shaping the broader Gothic tradition, modern horror cinema, and the global conception of vampires as seductive, dangerous, immortal figures. The lessons embedded in Dracula about fear, ethics, power, and the human psyche remain resonant, offering insights into both the era of its creation and the timeless dynamics of myth and imagination that in modern pop culture. Dracula has been endlessly reinterpreted to reflect contemporary anxieties and tastes that in film. He oscillates between monster and antihero, from Todd Browning's 1931 Bela Lugosi portrayal, emphasizing hypnotic menace and aristocratic charm, to Hammer horror's Christopher Lee emphasizing sexualized brutality and raw physical power. More recently, he has appeared as a complex antihero or tragic figure in films like Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992, by Francis Ford Coppola, where his love and loss are foregrounded alongside his predatory nature, blurring the line between villain and sympathetic protagonist. Each reinterpretation selectively emphasizes facets of the original Gothic template: aristocracy, supernatural power, eroticism, tailoring them to the cultural moment. That Dracula's influence extends into television, where serialized storytelling allows for deeper psychological exploration. That in shows like Dracula, BBC/Netflix, 2020, and Dracula, 1990s. The vampire is reimagined as a manipulator of social and political systems, embedding his predation within long-form narratives that explore morality, identity, and immortality. These adaptations often amplify his intellect and strategic cunning, transforming him from a purely monstrous threat into a figure capable of engaging with contemporary social structures and ethical dilemmas. Video games have also embraced Dracula as both antagonist and playable character, from the Castlevania series to Bloodborne and Vampire, each iteration emphasizing different mechanics, combat prowess, psychological manipulation, or narrative choice. While maintaining his gothic and aristocratic aura, literature continues to reinterpret Dracula as well, from vampire romance and erotic gothic to horror comedy and metafictional pastiches. Authors such as Kim Newman, Stephen King, and Rice, and Charlaine Harris draw upon Stoker's archetype, adapting it to new genres and social contexts, blending traditional horror with modern psychological, social, and sexual concerns. That Dracula's narrative flexibility allows authors to explore issues of desire, predation, morality, and immortality without losing the connection to the original mythos, the novel's epistolary structure, in which multiple perspectives and subjective accounts coexist, offers a model for exploring fragmented consciousness, unreliable narration, and the interplay between fear and knowledge. Dracula has also become a subject of scholarly interest in fields ranging from literary studies and folklore to psychology and cultural theory. Scholars examine how his aristocratic demeanor, sexualized threat, and supernatural powers serve as metaphors for historical fears, foreign invasion, urbanization, scientific disruption, gender transgression, and the instability of social hierarchies. His repeated return in popular culture demonstrates the resilience of Gothic archetypes and how they could be reshaped to express changing societal anxieties while retaining core elements: predation, immortality, and the tension between fascination and repulsion. In addition, Dracula has transcended media entirely, becoming a symbol in fashion, marketing, and even music. His aesthetic, the flowing cape, high collar, glowing eyes, fangs, has been commodified and referenced in countless products from costumes to graphic design, serving as a visual shorthand for danger, mystery, and seduction. This visual and symbolic recognition allows Dracula to operate as a semiotic touchstone, instantly evoking Gothic horror, aristocratic menace, and forbidden desire without any textual explanation. Even in global reinterpretations, Dracula adapts seamlessly. That he is recast in Japanese anime and manga as a supernatural antihero, while Eastern European cinema emphasizes his folkloric and historical roots. That he appears in American comics, animated series, role-playing games, and VR experiences, each emphasizing different aspects of his character: monster, strategist, lovelorn tragic hero, or predator of night. His adaptability illustrates his mythic function. He is a vessel for projection, able to embody anxieties, desires, and fears across cultures, eras, and genres. Dracula's enduring fascination lies in this duality. He is both familiar and alien, terrifying and alluring, ancient and modern. That he is an archetype shaped by history, folklore, and literature, assembled into a cohesive figure whose very ambiguity allows each generation to reinterpret him according to its own fears and fantasies. He remains the quintessential Gothic monster because he is simultaneously a product of his time and a timeless symbol, capable of reflecting the evolving human psyche in all its complexities. Dracula's symbolism operates on multiple intertwined levels, each reflecting the anxieties, desires, and moral preoccupations of the culture that produced him at a basic level. He is a representation of the foreign other, an invasive force that threatens the integrity of Victorian England. His Eastern European origins, alien customs, and supernatural abilities situate him as a destabilizing presence within a modern, ordered society, mirroring widespread fears of immigration, political upheaval, and the perceived fragility of social hierarchies. Dracula's aristocratic veneer heightens this threat. He is not a common peasant or wild beast, but a cultured, educated, strategic predator capable of infiltrating the very spaces considered safe, the drawing rooms, bedchambers, and institutions of polite society. Sexuality is central to Dracula's threat and fascination. His predation is never merely physical. It is deeply eroticized, invading intimate spaces and violating social norms. His victims, particularly Lucy and Mina, experience a transformation that blurs the line between fear and desire, the forbidden and the alluring. The vampiric bite operates as a metaphor for transgressive sexuality, a sudden, intimate, life-altering intrusion that destabilizes traditional gender roles and moral expectations. For Victorian readers, accustomed to rigidly defined social and sexual boundaries, Dracula embodies the horror of uncontrolled passion, unrestrained female desire, and the intrusion of foreign sexual mores into the heart of the domestic sphere. Morality and order are recurring themes in Stoker's narrative. Dracula embodies transgression, chaos, and the corruption of natural law, while his pursuers, Van Helsing, Harker, Seward, Morris, represent rationality, science, and moral authority. The novel dramatizes a conflict between civilization and barbarism, progress and superstition, science and the supernatural. That Dracula's undead nature allows him to transgress natural limits, challenging assumptions about life, death, and human agency. His persistence and resilience underscore the fragility of human institutions when confronted with primal, ancient forces, forcing characters to marshal intellect, faith, and courage to restore equilibrium. Stoker also explores the interplay between knowledge and power, that Dracula's abilities, hypnosis, shape-shifting, control over animals, make him both omniscient and omnipotent within his domain. The epistolary structure of the novel reinforces this tension, providing multiple viewpoints and fragmented knowledge, forcing readers to piece together events alongside the characters. In this way, Dracula becomes a test of perception, interpretation, and the limits of rationality, demonstrating that knowledge alone is insufficient without action and moral courage. His supernatural mastery contrasts with the methodical, scientific, collective efforts of his pursuers, highlighting the Victorian belief that disciplined, modern knowledge can confront even the most archaic and terrifying threats. The domestic and social dimensions of Dracula's horror are equally important. His presence disrupts family structures and communal bonds, creating paranoia and suspicion. He attacks the home, tradition, and intimacy, turning familiar spaces into sites of danger. His impact on Mina, Harker, Lucy, and their social circle illustrates how the Gothic monster is inseparable from the networks of human relationships he invades. His threat is not only personal but societal, reflecting broader concerns about contagion, disease, moral decay, and the vulnerability of seemingly secure institutions. Finally, Dracula embodies a temporal tension, existing simultaneously in the past and the present. He is the medieval warlord, rooted in feudal violence and historical cruelty. But he is also a modern predator, navigating trains, telegraphs, and contemporary social structures. His ability to traverse time and space blurs the boundary between historical memory and current reality, reminding readers that the past violence and moral ambiguity continue to echo in the present. That Stoker's novel uses Dracula to dramatize the anxiety that modernity cannot fully contain history, that ancient evils, desires, and transgressions persist beneath the polished surface of contemporary life. The cultural longevity of Dracula lies in his malleability. Each era reshapes him to reflect contemporary fears, insecurities, and fascinations. That in the early 20th century, stage adaptations and silent films emphasize Gothic atmosphere and personal horror, turning Dracula into a figure of suspense and psychological dread rather than historical realism. Lugosi's 1931 film transformed him into an icon of charisma and hypnotic allure, cementing the image of the vampire as both aristocratic and erotically charged. Christopher Lee's portrayal in the 1950s and 60s reintroduced the physicality and violence of the medieval warlord, melding eroticism with brutality. demonstrating that the vampire could embody multiple fears simultaneously without losing. Coherence. Dracula's adaptability also allows him to function as a social mirror. His foreignness can symbolize anxieties about immigration, globalization, or cultural change. His aristocratic lineage raises questions about inherited power, privilege, and exploitation. His predation can signify sexual transgression, infectious disease, or moral corruption. His survival and repeated reinvention show that monsters endure because they speak to recurring human concerns, the vulnerabilities, desires, and ethical dilemmas that persist across generations. The psychological dimension of Dracula is equally compelling. He is the projection of unacknowledged fears and suppressed desires. The terror he inspires is both external and internal, forcing characters and readers to confront the darker aspects of human nature. His control over others' minds, his ability to manipulate and seduce, creates an intimate horror, one that operates through suggestion, illusion, and subtle dominance, not just overt violence. This dimension of the vampire taps into anxieties about personal agency, consent, and moral integrity, demonstrating that fear often originates as much from within as from without. Dracula's mythos is thus a complex synthesis. Historical echoes of Vlad the Impaler, folklore traditions of revenants, literary precedents like Polidori's Lord Ruth and Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla, combined with Stoker's own life experiences and Victorian cultural anxieties. Each component contributes to a multidimensional figure who is at once a historical specter, supernatural predator, and psychological archetype. Through careful integration of these elements, Stoker created a character capable of enduring transformation, remaining terrifying, seductive, and relevant for well over a century. Moreover, Stoker's Dracula functions as a narrative laboratory, exploring themes of empire, gender, sexuality, morality, and mortality, that he dramatizes the collision between rationality and superstition, science and the unknown, domestic security and external threat. His vampire is a figure whose terror is amplified by his intelligence, strategy, and adaptability, making him a model for subsequent fictional monsters across genres. That Dracula's endurance in popular culture is not accidental. He embodies fears and fascinations that are both universal and historically specific, allowing each generation to project its own anxieties onto him. As a result, Dracula is simultaneously a product of Victorian England, a figure rooted in Eastern European history, and a timeless symbol of the dark, compelling, inescapable aspects of human nature. His power resides in his capacity to be many things at once: predator, seducer, outsider, tragic hero, an enduring myth. Dracula's influence extends far beyond the pages of Stoker's novel, shaping literature, film, television, and even video games for over a century. His figure establishes a blueprint for the vampire archetype: aristocratic yet predatory, sophisticated yet brutal, seductive yet deadly. This duality allows the character to function across genres, from gothic horror to romance, psychological thriller, and even action-adventure. Modern vampire fiction, from Anne Rice's Interview with the Vampire to contemporary series like The Vampire Diaries, draws directly on Stoker's integration of historical resonance, folkloric realism, and psychological tension. Cinematic adaptations have amplified and diversified Dracula's persona. Lugosi's early 20th century portrayal cemented the visual shorthand: high-collared cape, hypnotic gaze, and aristocratic bearing. These visual cues became iconic, influencing generations of horror aesthetics, marketing, merchandise, and even Halloween imagery. Christopher Lee's performances added raw physicality and sexual intensity, emphasizing the vampire as a creature of overt desire and fear. Later adaptations, from Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992, to modern reinterpretations, explore new angles: tragic vulnerability, romantic longing, or even ethical ambiguity. The character's adaptability ensures that each retelling resonates with contemporary social, psychological, and moral anxieties. Dracula also functions as a mirror for societal fears. In Victorian England, he embodied anxieties about foreign infiltration, moral decay, and the destabilization of domestic order. In the Cold War era, he could symbolize ideological or political threats that in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, he has been interpreted as a metaphor for disease, predatory capitalism, or ecological disaster. The monster's power lies in his ambiguity. Is a vessel into which successive generations pour their fears, allowing the figure to remain culturally relevant without losing his core identity. The vampire's allure is not limited to terror. His aristocratic demeanor, eternal youth, and forbidden sexuality make him irresistibly compelling, a figure of both fear and fascination. This dual appeal explains why Dracula and his descendants dominate popular culture. He embodies the tension between attraction and danger, the known and the unknown, the civilized and the primal. He is both a moral test and an object of desire, forcing characters and audiences alike to confront their instincts, curiosity, and anxieties about power, control, and mortality. In literature, Dracula opened the door to a host of hybrid monsters, combining historical detail, folkloric depth, and psychological realism. His presence legitimized Gothic horror as a serious literary endeavor, demonstrating that supernatural fiction could explore complex social, psychological, and cultural issues. Bram Stoker's method of blending research, travel narratives, folklore, and personal experience created a template for immersive, credible supernatural storytelling, a model that writers continue to emulate. Dracula's immortality is thus twofold. He endures as both a character and a concept, a character. He evolves, adapting to new settings, audiences, and artistic media, a concept. He represents the persistent fears and fascinations of humanity, foreignness, desire, violence, decay, and the tension between life and death, order and chaos. His story, rooted in history, yet unbound by it, demonstrates the power of myth-making, showing how fiction can transform historical shadows into enduring cultural icons. Dracula evolved across media. His symbolic power expanded beyond horror into broader cultural commentary. In film, television, and literature, he became a prism through which creators examined human fears about power, identity, and desire. The vampire's aristocratic status allowed storytellers to explore social hierarchies and class anxieties, highlighting tensions between the elite and the common people. His immortality and supernatural abilities created a lens for contemplating mortality, legacy, and the persistence of evil across generations. In this sense, Dracula is less a single monster than a cultural instrument, shaped by each era's collective psyche. In the 20th century, Dracula's presence in cinema transformed from Gothic menace to romantic antihero. Lugosi's hypnotic elegance and Lee's commanding presence emphasized the allure of the predator, blurring the line between horror and seduction. This shift allowed audiences to confront complex emotions: fear, attraction, repulsion, desire. Simultaneously, the vampire became a metaphor for the darker aspects of human nature: uncontrolled appetites, hidden instincts, and moral ambiguity. His seduction of victims became an allegory for the dangers of forbidden desire, reflecting evolving social attitudes towards sexuality and power dynamics. Dracula also serves as a mirror for technological and social change. His infiltration of London in the 19th century echoes fears of urbanization, migration, and globalization. His ability to manipulate modern tools, telegraphs, railways, photography, positions him as a figure capable of exploiting both tradition and progress. Simultaneously, his ancient knowledge and supernatural prowess create tension between modern rationality and the enduring power of myth. This duality mirrors contemporary anxieties about science, reason, spirituality, and the unknown, ensuring the vampire remains a relevant symbol across generations. In literature, the Dracula archetype has inspired countless reinterpretations and spin-offs, From the sexually charged vampires of Anne Rice to the morally conflicted protagonists of modern young adult fiction, authors draw on Stoker's synthesis of historical, folkloric, and psychological elements to create vampires who are simultaneously terrifying and empathetic. These adaptations often explore identity, ethics, and social integration, using the vampire's liminal status as a metaphor for otherness, marginalization, and personal transformation. That Dracula's ability to cross genres, from horror to romance to fantasy, demonstrates the flexibility and endurance of Stoker's original vision. Globally, Dracula has become a cultural icon transcending literary origins. His name evokes instant recognition, conjuring imagery of castles, blood, night, and supernatural terror. He appears in films, television, video games, graphic novels, stage plays, and merchandising, demonstrating his omnipresence in the collective imagination. His adaptability reflects not only the richness of Stoker's creation, but also the human propensity to reuse, remix, and reinterpret myths according to the needs and anxieties of the present. Cultural fear, psychological fascination, and narrative utility intersect in Dracula, ensuring that he remains endlessly relevant. At his core, Dracula embodies the tension between control and chaos, order and transgression. He is aristocratic yet primal, seductive yet deadly, ancient yet modern. This combination allows him to function simultaneously as a monster, lover, tyrant, and tragic. Figured, he is a cipher through which audiences can explore mortality, desire, social instability, and cultural anxiety. His immortality in fiction mirrors the enduring power of myth, demonstrating how carefully constructed stories, rooted in research, folklore, and imagination, can resonate across centuries. Dracula's enduring appeal also lies in his role as a vessel for moral and existential exploration. Through the vampire, authors and audiences confront questions of life, death, and the consequences of moral transgression. His predation forces characters and readers to confront the fragility of human life, the boundaries of ethical action, and the inevitability of mortality. Dracula's hunger for blood becomes a symbolic reflection of human appetites for power, pleasure, and survival. His supernatural longevity, juxtaposed with human vulnerability, magnifies these concerns, turning every encounter into a meditation on the transient nature of existence. In narrative terms, Dracula operates as both antagonist and mirror, challenging protagonists to recognize their limitations, resolve, and courage. His presence exposes societal weaknesses, the dependence on rigid class structures, the fragility of domestic security, the limits of science when confronted with the unknown. His calculated manipulations and psychological sophistication elevate him beyond a mere monster. He embodies strategy, intelligence, and patience, forcing characters to adapt and innovate in order to survive. His threat is therefore both physical and conceptual, a challenge to the intellectual, emotional, and moral faculties of those who confront him. Moreover, Dracula's hybridity, part human, part supernatural, allows him to straddle multiple symbolic registers, that he is at once historical and mythic, realistic and fantastical, physical and psychological. This liminality enables creators to emphasize different aspects according to context. His aristocracy may highlight class anxiety. His predatory sexuality may explore repression or desire. His foreign origins may reflect xenophobia or cultural tension. The flexibility of his characterization ensures that Dracula can be continually reinvented while retaining his core identity as a figure of fascination and fear. The vampire's domestic infiltration in Stoker's novel, the quiet corruption of homes, bedrooms, and intimate spaces, anticipates the modern horror trope of the monster within the familiar. This invasion transforms safe spaces into sites of terror, mirroring real-world anxieties about hidden threats in society, illness, or moral decay. Why presenting Dracula's power as both external and intimate. Stoker ensures that horror operates on multiple levels. He terrifies not only with the supernatural, but also with the psychological and social implications of his presence. As Dracula spread through adaptations in the 20th century, the character's symbolic versatility grew. The monster could be sexualized, romanticized, or vilified, depending on narrative need. Horror films emphasized visual spectacle, cinematic atmosphere, and immediate fear. Literature explored the internal psychological ramifications of vampirism, and stage adaptations often focused on suspense, dialogue, and social interaction that in every medium. Dracula remained a conduit for exploring human fears, desires, and cultural anxieties, demonstrating the universality and adaptability of Stoker's invention that in contemporary culture. Dracula also serves as a lens for examining historical and cultural continuity. His origins in the violent frontier politics of Eastern Europe, combined with the folkloric beliefs of Transylvania and the literary precedents from Polidori and Le Fanu, illustrate how myths evolved by accumulating layers of meaning. Stoker's genius was in synthesizing these diverse sources into a coherent yet flexible archetype capable of resonating across centuries, continents, and media forms. His monster is simultaneously anchored in history and liberated from it, providing a bridge between fact, myth, and imagination. Finally, Dracula's immortality in fiction underscores the human fascination with power, danger, and transgression that he embodies the ultimate other, a being whose freedom from human constraints allows him to explore desires and actions forbidden or impossible to ordinary mortals. His ability to persist, adapt, and thrive across narrative contexts reflects the human tendency to project fears and fascinations onto enduring symbols. In this way, Dracula is not merely a product of Victorian anxieties or literary invention. He is an ongoing mirror of human psychology, a cultural touchstone, an archetype whose presence continues to provoke, enthrall, and terrify. In the 20th and 21st centuries, Dracula evolved from the literary monster of Stoker's imagination into a global icon of horror and fascination. Early cinema, beginning with the silent adaptations of the 1920s, translated the textual Gothic into visual spectacle, emphasizing atmosphere, shadow, and the uncanny. The German expressionist influence of films like Nosferatu, 1922, introduced distorted perspectives, harsh lighting, and haunting silhouettes, reinforcing Dracula's connection to death, decay, and unnaturalness. The figure of Count Orlok in Nosferatu, though legally renamed due to copyright issues, retained the essential features of Stoker's creation: predatory hunger, foreign otherness, supernatural powers, and the ability to instill dread through both appearance and action. The film's visual language would influence generations of vampire imagery, cementing the archetype of the sinister outsider lurking in the shadows. The 1931 Universal adaptation, featuring Bela Lugosi, shifted Dracula toward the elegant and aristocratic, introducing the now iconic tuxedo, cape, and hypnotic gaze. This version emphasized charm, poise, and controlled menace, showing that terror could be seductive as well as frightening. Lugosi's performance highlighted Dracula's capacity for social integration, his ability to navigate the upper-class milieu while concealing predatory intent. This portrayal resonated deeply with audiences, and for many, defined Dracula visually and culturally, even overshadowing the literary original. The hypnotic stare, deliberate movements, and controlled voice became shorthand for vampiric power, ensuring that Dracula's image could transcend both medium and generation. Hammer Horror's Dracula films, starring Christopher Lee in the 1950s and 1960s, reintroduced the monster's overt physicality and sensuality. These films highlighted violence, sexual tension, and raw energy, returning Dracula closer to the primal and predatory figure of Stoker's historical and folkloric inspirations. Lee's Dracula was overtly sexual, visually commanding, brutally violent, and morally terrifying. This dual emphasis on aristocratic sophistication and physical domination created a model that combined psychological dread with corporeal horror. The cinematic reinterpretation demonstrated the flexibility of the character. He could be refined or feral, seductive or terrifying, both preserving and transforming Stoker's original synthesis. Beyond cinema, literature continued to reinterpret Dracula in ways that reflected contemporary concerns. Modern authors explored themes such as gender dynamics, sexual liberation, political corruption, and existential dread. The vampire became a mirror for each era's anxieties. Fears of contagion and disease in the early 20th century, Cold War paranoia and totalitarianism in mid-century fiction, questions of morality, identity, and sexuality in late 20th century novels and graphic novels. That Dracula's adaptability derives from his symbolic opacity. He is never entirely fixed, allowing each generation to project its own fears, desires, and cultural questions onto him. In popular culture, Dracula has moved beyond the Gothic mansion and shadowed castle into urban landscapes, suburban streets, even cyberspace. The essential attributes remain: his predation, his sophistication, his connection to death, and his capacity to inspire terror and fascination. But modern adaptations explore his motivations, his internal conflicts, his loneliness, and even his potential for redemption. Dracula's mythos now encompasses romance, psychological horror, action, comedy, and social critique, demonstrating the creature's extraordinary narrative elasticity. Moreover, Dracula continues to influence genres beyond traditional horror. Fantasy, science fiction, gothic romance, and thriller narratives all draw on the structural, psychological, and symbolic innovations Stoker synthesized. His presence validates the intersection of history, folklore, psychology, and literary tradition, showing how a single mythic figure can bridge cultural eras, geographies, and media forms. Each reinterpretation, while adding new layers, retains echoes of Stoker's original vision. Fusion of aristocracy, ferocity, supernatural power, psychological manipulation, and symbolic resonance with contemporary fears. That Dracula's immortality, therefore, is not merely narrative but cultural. That he persists because he is a mirror, a vessel, and a symbol, absorbing each era's anxieties while retaining the essential terror of the outsider who can infiltrate, manipulate, and disrupt society. His ability to evolve while remaining instantly recognizable demonstrates the power of Stoker's synthesis of history, folklore, and literary precedent. He is a monster who is always of his time, yet always timeless, a creature who thrives not only on the blood of victims, but on the imagination of generations. In contemporary media, Dracula has become a vessel for exploring psychological and societal themes beyond simple horror. His vampirism is often reframed as a metaphor for addiction, desire, predation, and the inescapable weight of history. Modern novels, television series, comics, and video games explore Dracula's internal consciousness, examining his loneliness, regret, and moral ambiguity. This introspection transforms him from a purely external threat into a complex character whose evil is intertwined with existential suffering. For example, graphic novels and serialized TV often depict Dracula struggling with his nature, questioning the morality of feeding, or confronting the consequences of immortality, blurring the line between villain and tragic antihero. Dracula's adaptability also allows him to comment on cultural anxieties. That he embodies fears of contagion, disease, and biological invasion in a world increasingly aware of pandemics. He reflects anxieties about immigration, foreign influence, and societal change. He serves as a figure through whom gender, sexuality, identity, and power can be interrogated. In speculative fiction, Dracula can be a metaphor for technological threats, corporate predation, or even ecological collapse, demonstrating that his myth transcends the Gothic castle and Victorian. More is to engage with global, modern realities. Transmedia storytelling has amplified Dracula's reach and influence. That he inhabits films, animated features, novels, comic books, graphic novels, web series, video games, and tabletop RPGs, each medium emphasizing different aspects of his character. Some narratives highlight his strategic intelligence and manipulation. Others emphasize horror and shock value, while yet others explore romance, loneliness, or existential dread. His form and function shift according to medium, allowing each iteration to emphasize specific thematic concerns while maintaining the recognizable traits: immortality, predation, supernatural power, aristocratic bearing, psychological influence that define Dracula. Psychologically, Dracula embodies the tension between desire and morality, pleasure and death, freedom and societal constraint. His immortality isolates him, forcing confrontation with time, loss, change, and the consequences of actions across centuries. This timelessness enables creators to explore philosophical and ethical questions that humans cannot fully experience. Eternal boredom, the burden of memory, and the ethical implications of eternal life. Dracula's mind becomes as rich a terrain for horror and fascination as his fangs or hypnotic powers. Culturally, Dracula persists because he is at once familiar and alien. He represents the eternal outsider, one who navigates societies without being fully part of them, who observes and manipulates but is never fully integrated. His foreignness, once framed as Eastern European menace in early 20th century literature and film, has evolved into a more nuanced exploration of otherness, allowing Dracula to reflect on immigration, cultural displacement, or the tension between individuality and conformity. His ability to adapt to contemporary fears, biological, technological, social, psychological, ensures that he remains relevant across generations. In literature, television, and film, Dracula often intersects with other mythologies, vampire, tropes, and supernatural traditions. This intertextuality enriches his character, allowing dialogue between folklore, history, and popular culture. His storylines now often involve global settings, time travel, alternate histories, or speculative futures, while retaining the essence of predation, eternal life, and symbolic resonance, that he is simultaneously a monster and a mirror. His mythos providing a lens through which creators explore human fears, desires, and the ethical dilemmas of power and immortality. Dracula's ongoing evolution demonstrates a fundamental principle of myth. Its survival depends on adaptability, recognition, and resonance. His narrative can be reshaped, amplified, or reframed, while audiences instantly recognize the archetypal qualities that define him: charisma, supernatural dominance, psychological insight, and predatory threat. His capacity to absorb contemporary fears while maintaining timeless Gothic elements illustrates the enduring strength of Stoker's creation and the cultural power of the vampire archetype. In literature, Dracula continues to inspire reinterpretation and pastiche. Authors explore alternative histories, psychological depths, or moral ambiguity, asking what it means to live as or alongside a vampire. Some narratives place him in the modern world, grappling with contemporary technology, media scrutiny, or political structures, while others revisit the historical Victorian and Transylvanian contexts, highlighting the socio-political undercurrents of empire, colonial anxieties, and the clash of civilizations. Dracula's flexibility as a narrative tool allows him to function as both antagonist and cultural mirror, his story endlessly adaptable to the themes that each generation finds pressing. Academics studying Dracula note that the vampire is particularly effective because he embodies liminality, existing between life and death, foreign and familiar, man and monster, desire and danger. His ability to infiltrate domestic spaces, seduce the innocent, or manipulate social hierarchies exemplifies the tension between the visible and hidden aspects of society. That Dracula's liminal nature also allows him to serve as a metaphor for hidden social and psychological anxieties, including fears about sexuality, gender transgression, racial difference, and moral decay. His presence in a narrative destabilizes ordinary life, forcing characters and audiences alike to confront the unknown lurking just beyond the boundaries of civilization. Moreover, Dracula's mythos has inspired creative exploration beyond narrative fiction. His image and symbolism appear in visual art, performance, music, graphic novels, cosplay, interactive experiences, and gaming culture. The vampire serves as a cultural icon, his attributes codified into recognizable tropes. The fang bite, the nocturnal predator, the coffin of native soil, the hypnotic gaze, and the aristocratic bearing. These elements are employed not only for horror, but also for aesthetic, romantic, or metaphorical purposes, demonstrating the enduring power of Stoker's foundational creation. Dracula's influence extends even into societal discourse, where the figure has been invoked metaphorically to discuss economic exploitation, predatory leadership, public health crises, bloodborne pathogens, and ecological depletion. His archetype, the charismatic exploiter, eternally consuming yet ostensibly civilized, remains a compelling lens through which to examine patterns of power and vulnerability in human society. His presence is simultaneously cautionary, reflective, and thrilling, reminding audiences that the boundary between civilization and savagery is perilously thin. In the 21st century, Dracula's image has been reshaped to reflect contemporary anxieties and aesthetics. Modern adaptations frequently explore the psychological, ethical, and existential dimensions of vampirism, rather than focusing solely on physical horror. This includes examining immortality's impact on identity, memory, and morality, as well as the interplay between desire, consent, and power. Dynamics that in novels, television, film, and video games. Dracula often appears as a tragic antihero or complex antagonist, rather than a purely evil figure. This nuanced portrayal allows audiences to empathize with him while still acknowledging the threat he poses, blurring the lines between villainy and victimhood. Globalized media has also transformed Dracula into an international icon, removing him from the strictly European context of Stoker's novel. In films, comics, and streaming series, he interacts with cultures and technologies far removed from 19th century Transylvania, highlighting the vampire's adaptability as a narrative figure. Modern storytellers use him to probe issues such as surveillance, social isolation, genetic engineering, and the ethical consequences of scientific experimentation. His supernatural abilities, shape-shifting, immortality, hypnosis, serve as metaphors for the unstoppable spread of ideas, power, and influence, allowing Dracula to function simultaneously as a horror figure and a mirror for societal anxieties. Dracula's presence in interactive media, games, and virtual reality has further solidified his role as a cultural touchstone. Players can embody him or confront him, creating personalized experiences of fear, agency, and morality. This interactivity adds new dimensions to the mythos, allowing individuals to explore the consequences of vampiric power while navigating ethical dilemmas and strategic challenges. The immersive nature of these experiences emphasizes Dracula's enduring appeal. He is not only a character to observe, but one whose presence can be directly engaged, challenged, or assumed. Fashion, music, and visual art also draw on Dracula's iconic imagery. The high-collared cloak, fanged silhouette, pale visage, and Gothic architecture have become shorthand for elegance, horror, romance, and rebellion in subcultures ranging from goth to cosplay to avant-garde art. The vampire aesthetic provides a way to negotiate identity, express transgression, and explore themes of mortality and desire. Dracula's image functions both as costume and symbol, a bridge between historical narrative and personal expression. Academic studies have increasingly interpreted Dracula as a symbol of cultural fluidity and hybridity. His transnational appeal demonstrates how myths travel and evolve, absorbing local folklore, mythology, and social concerns in each cultural context. Dracula reflects specific anxieties, the fear of contagion, immigration, and the other, the fascination with sexuality, violence, and transgression, and the allure of power, knowledge, and immortality. This adaptability ensures that Dracula remains relevant, allowing storytellers to use his archetype to address contemporary social, psychological, and existential concerns. Ultimately, Dracula endures because he embodies fundamental tensions in human experience. The intersection of desire and fear, freedom and constraint, life and death. His story invites reflection on the limits of humanity, the persistence of myth, and the ways in which narrative shapes cultural understanding. His legacy is not static. It evolves with each generation, remaining a living, breathing presence in literature, film, media, art, and collective imagination. Dracula is both a mirror and a shadow, a character who compels us to confront our deepest fears while offering the thrill of immersion into a world where the ordinary laws of life no longer apply. Dracula's influence extends far beyond literature and film. He has become a global cultural phenomenon, appearing in cartoons, video games, graphic novels, advertising, theme parks, and even consumer products. His image is instantly recognizable worldwide, a symbol of both horror and sophistication. This ubiquity demonstrates how a single literary creation can transcend its original medium, entering the shared imagination of countless cultures and generations in video games. Dracula is often a final boss or central antagonist, his abilities adapted to interactive mechanics. From the Castlevania series to modern RPGs, he challenges players with a combination of cunning, supernatural powers, and psychological manipulation. These games preserve his gothic roots while modernizing his threat, placing him in sprawling castles, technologically advanced lairs, or urban environments. Players are invited not only to confront him, but to navigate his strategies, mirroring the intellectual and tactical challenges his victims faced in Stoker's novel. Dracula also functions as a vehicle for exploring contemporary social issues. In modern literature and film, he can represent toxic relationships, abusive power dynamics, or the psychological toll of immortality. His vampirism becomes a metaphor for addiction, disease, or social alienation. By framing the vampire in these terms, creators can explore human fears and moral dilemmas, allowing Dracula to remain a mirror for our anxieties while retaining the thrills of Gothic horror. Parodies and reinterpretations have also cemented Dracula in popular consciousness. Countless comedy sketches, animated films, and satirical works play with his image, from the bumbling vampire of the Abbott and Costello films to family-friendly portrayals in The Addams Family or Hotel Transylvania. These adaptations emphasize his archetypal qualities, his aristocratic elegance, his nocturnal habits, his fangs, while softening his horror for broader audiences. The result is a character that is simultaneously terrifying and endearing, flexible enough to inhabit multiple narrative tones. That Dracula's continued relevance is also sustained by his symbolic malleability. He can embody the fears of disease, foreign invasion, technological change, or social decay, depending on the historical context. In post-colonial readings, he represents the anxieties of cultural intrusion and exploitation. In psychoanalytic interpretations, he symbolizes unconscious desire and repressed impulses. In feminist critiques, his predation highlights questions of bodily autonomy and gendered power dynamics. Each lens adds depth to the archetype, ensuring that Dracula remains a subject of study, adaptation, and fascination across disciplines. Even in fashion and art, Dracula's presence is pervasive. Gothic architecture, Victorian clothing styles, high-collared cloaks, and pale, haunting aesthetics draw directly from the vampire tradition. Photographers, illustrators, and designers continue to reference his visual iconography, creating works that merge horror with elegance, decay with beauty. These artistic interpretations reinforce Dracula's dual nature. He is both monster and aristocrat, death and desire, history and myth. In short, Dracula's immortality is cultural as much as narrative. He has been continuously reimagined, his essence distilled into a set of archetypal traits. A foreign yet alluring outsider, an immortal predator, an embodiment of fear and fascination that resonate across media, genres, and societies. Each generation reinvents him to reflect its own anxieties, ensuring that Stoker's creation remains not just a story from the 19th century, but a living myth for the modern world. In contemporary media, Dracula's figure has evolved to address the complexities of modern life. Television series, novels, and films explore his psychology, interior life, and moral ambiguity, transforming him from a simple predator into a character capable of introspection, conflict, and even reluctant heroism. Shows like Dracula, BBC/Netflix, and novels such as The Historian portray him with nuance, examining the weight of immortality, the loneliness of centuries, and the consequences of his actions. In these narratives, Dracula becomes a mirror for human dilemmas, ethics, identity, loss, and the tension between desire and responsibility. The vampire mythos has also expanded through crossover genres. Dracula appears in steampunk, urban fantasy, horror comedy, and even science fiction, demonstrating his adaptability. By placing him in unfamiliar contexts, modern cities, space stations, futuristic societies, authors and filmmakers test the resilience of his archetype. His essence, the aristocratic menace, the predatory intellect, the supernatural abilities, remains intact, even as the setting and narrative framework change. This flexibility keeps him relevant to audiences who may never encounter Gothic castles or fog-shrouded moors. Dracula's symbolic power extends to cultural commentary in postmodern literature. He is used to critique globalization, capitalism, and social alienation. His hunger for blood can be interpreted as a metaphor for exploitation or consumption. His infiltration of society as a critique of hidden corruption or unchecked power. By projecting contemporary fears onto a timeless figure, creators can explore societal anxieties in a tangible, visceral way. The vampire's immortality also allows exploration of mortality, legacy, and the consequences of unchanging influence in an ever-shifting world. The figure of Dracula has also inspired scholarship, critical theory, and philosophical reflection. Academics analyze his role in shaping ideas about race, class, gender, and sexuality, examining how a 19th century Gothic creation can illuminate 21st century concerns. He is studied in literary theory, film studies, folklore, history, and psychology, showing the depth and breadth of his cultural impact. These examinations reinforce the idea that Dracula is more than a character. He is a vessel for understanding human fears, desires, and social anxieties across time. Merchandise, theme parks, cosplay, and fan conventions further cement his presence. Dracula-inspired events and communities allow people to engage with his mythos directly, celebrating both horror and fantasy. This participatory culture ensures that Dracula remains alive in collective imagination, shaping identity, culture, and entertainment in tangible ways. Fans reinterpret and personalize his story, bridging the gap between literary origin and lived experience. Ultimately, Dracula endures because he is fundamentally adaptable. He embodies timeless fears and desires. The fear of death, of the unknown, of predation, the desire for power, eternity, and forbidden knowledge. His aristocratic elegance and predatory nature create a tension that resonates universally. Each adaptation, literary, cinematic, digital, or performative, reinforces the core of the character while allowing him to reflect the evolving fears and fantasies of society. Dracula's immortality is thus both narrative and cultural. Bram Stoker constructed a monster that could survive history, media, and changing social consciousness. By blending history, folklore, literary precedent, psychology, and eroticism, he forged a character that is not merely read but experienced, reinterpreted, reimagined, and inhabited across generations. Dracula's legacy is the proof that a myth can live beyond its origin, feeding on imagination, anxiety, and fascination, remaining as vital today as it was when the first Gothic shadows fell across the cliffs of Whitby. Dracula's influence on modern horror and vampire archetypes is profound and far-reaching. His presence established conventions that would define the genre for over a century. The nocturnal predator, the aristocratic menace, the seductive danger, and the tension between modern rationality and ancient superstition. Authors like Anne Rice, in the Vampire Chronicles, expanded upon Dracula's template, exploring the inner lives, moral ambiguity, and psychological depth of vampires. Rice's vampires are not merely monsters. They are sentient beings grappling with immortality, identity, and emotion, a direct evolution of the complex figure that Stoker synthesized from history, folklore, and Gothic tradition. Cinema amplified Dracula's archetype. Beyond Bela Lugosi and Christopher Lee, directors such as Francis Ford Coppola and Bram Stoker's Dracula, 1992, reintroduced historical and romantic dimensions, blending fidelity to Stoker's text with cinematic grandeur. Coppola emphasized the duality of Dracula as both lover and predator, a being capable of profound passion and unspeakable violence, underscoring the enduring interplay between eroticism and terror first glimpsed in Sheridan Le Fanu's Carmilla. Film adaptations expanded the vampire mythos visually, demonstrating how costume, setting, cinematography, and performance could communicate threat, allure, and timelessness simultaneously. Dracula's impact also extends into television and streaming narratives. Shows like Penny Dreadful and Dracula, BBC/Netflix, situate vampires within complex social and historical milieus, exploring colonial anxieties, gender politics, and psychological horror. These reinterpretations often reframe Dracula and his kind as metaphors for outsider status, forbidden desire, or societal corruption. The adaptability of the character allows creators to address contemporary issues, immigration, disease, technology, and power dynamics, while remaining faithful to the core Gothic horror that Stoker pioneered in literature. Dracula's archetype has become a foundational template, influencing characters who straddle the line between monstrosity and allure. From Edward Cullen in Twilight to Lestat in Rice's works, the traits of a sophisticated, morally complex, and seductive vampire trace directly back to Stoker's synthesis of Polidori's Byronic nobleman, Vlad the Impaler's historical terror, and Gerard's folkloric rigor. Each new incarnation demonstrates the malleability of Dracula's archetype, proving that a well-constructed myth can survive across centuries, continents, and media forms. That Dracula's symbolism also continues to resonate in critical theory and cultural studies. Scholars interpret him as a lens for exploring societal fears, imperial decline, disease, sexual liberation, and moral degeneration. In post-colonial readings, Dracula represents the return of the repressed, the consequences of empire and cultural otherness invading the heart of the dominant society. Feminist readings focus on the subversion of gender roles, highlighting the monstrous agency of female vampires and the destabilization of Victorian sexual norms. Themes first gestured toward in Carmilla and expanded in Dracula's Brides. Beyond literature and film, Dracula's figure informs gaming, comics, graphic novels, and digital media. Video games like Castlevania reinterpret his narrative, creating interactive experiences where players confront Dracula as both historical and mythical antagonist. Comics often explore Dracula's psychological depth, moral ambiguity, and enduring horror, allowing visual storytelling to reinterpret his form and abilities. These multimedia representations demonstrate the character's flexibility, highlighting how Stoker's original synthesis, a historical name, folkloric foundation, Gothic horror, and literary refinement, provides a structure that accommodates endless reinvention. The vampire's endurance is thus both narrative and social. Dracula operates as a mirror, reflecting fears of mortality, social change, cultural contamination, and forbidden desire. His immortality ensures that each generation can project its anxieties onto him, reshaping the monster to fit contemporary moral, cultural, and aesthetic frameworks. Dracula is, in essence, a living myth, a creature whose narrative evolves alongside society, whose terror adapts to new contexts, and whose symbolic resonance remains potent because it is never fixed, never fully knowable. Dracula's story, from Stoker's research in Whitby to his position in global media today, exemplifies the power of synthesis. By uniting history, folklore, Gothic tradition, psychological insight, and literary craft, Bram Stoker created not merely a character, but a cultural phenomenon. A monster, yes, but also a lens, a symbol, and an enduring cultural artifact. Dracula continues to haunt literature, cinema, and collective imagination because he embodies a fundamental human truth that fear, desire, and fascination are eternal, mutable, and inextricably intertwined in contemporary culture. Dracula has transcended his original Gothic roots to become a global icon whose identity is constantly reshaped by regional storytelling, media, and cultural anxieties. In Eastern Europe, particularly in Romania, Dracula is often linked directly to Vlad III, the historical impaler, blending folklore, national history, and tourism. Towns like Sighisoara and Brancaster have leveraged the Dracula legend to attract international visitors, blurring the lines between myth, history, and commerce. Here, Dracula functions not just as a fictional villain, but as a cultural touchstone, a symbol of resilience, brutality, and enigmatic authority. The myth adapts to place, offering a reflection of local identity and historical memory, while sustaining the core Gothic motifs of fear, darkness, and the uncanny in East Asian media. Dracula's mythos has been interpreted through the lens of anime, manga, and cinema, emphasizing transformation, duality, and philosophical introspection. Series like Hellsing and Vampire Hunter present vampires as both protectors and destroyers, often embedding Dracula-like figures with moral complexity and existential dilemmas. These adaptations shift the focus from purely predatory horror to ethical ambiguity, personal struggle, and cultural syncretism, demonstrating the universality of the vampire archetype and the flexibility of Dracula's narrative across global storytelling traditions. The digital age has introduced new dimensions to Dracula's legacy. Video games, augmented reality experiences, and interactive media allow audiences to engage with the vampire mythos in immersive ways. In games such as Bloodborne and Castlevania, Lords of Shadow, Dracula becomes not only an antagonist, but a narrative engine, a character whose decisions, morality, and power can be explored dynamically. Social media, streaming platforms, and digital fan communities further amplify Dracula's presence, enabling reinterpretations, fan fiction, and visual adaptations that expand his mythos beyond any single author's vision. Dracula's continued relevance is also tied to the psychological archetypes he embodies. As a figure, he represents the shadow's self, the allure of forbidden desire, the confrontation with death and the unknown. Jungian interpretations see him as a personification of the collective unconscious, the embodiment of humanity's darkest instincts, fears, and yearnings. Modern adaptations often emphasize these psychological dimensions, exploring Dracula not only as a monster to be defeated, but as a mirror reflecting human ambition, obsession, and transgression. Moreover, Dracula remains a vessel for societal critique. In postmodern narratives, he interrogates themes of power, sexuality, and morality. Graphic novels and films increasingly depict him as a morally ambiguous antihero, challenging traditional binary distinctions between good and evil. These interpretations often highlight social hierarchies, exploitation, and the tension between progress and tradition, showing how the vampire mythos can comment on contemporary issues while remaining rooted in centuries-old storytelling traditions. That Dracula's adaptability across cultures, media, and genres underscores the durability of Stoker's creation. He is simultaneously historical figure, folkloric specter, literary invention, cinematic icon, and cultural symbol. This multiplicity allows Dracula to remain endlessly relevant. His narrative can expand, contract, and transform according to the needs of storytellers and audiences. The character's essence, a combination of horror, seduction, and psychological complexity, remains intact even as the surrounding context shifts, ensuring that Dracula continues to captivate, terrify, and inspire new generations. In essence, Dracula's mythos is a testament to the power of narrative synthesis. By merging historical fact, folklore, Gothic horror, and psychological insight, Bram Stoker created a character whose influence would ripple across the globe for more than a century. Every adaptation, reinterpretation, and cultural translation adds layers to his identity, keeping him alive not only as a fictional entity, but as a living myth capable of reflecting the fears, desires, and anxieties of every era. Dracula's immortality is thus both literal and symbolic. He is a creature of the night, yes, but also a timeless mirror of human fascination with the dark, the forbidden, and the eternal. That Dracula's symbolic influence extends deeply into themes of sexuality, gender, and morality, shaping how narratives explore desire, transgression, and societal norms. From the moment Bram Stoker introduced the character, the vampire carried an undercurrent of sexual tension and forbidden attraction. Victorian anxieties about female sexuality, male dominance, and the instability of social hierarchies are embedded in his interactions with characters like Mina Harker and Lucy Westenra. Dracula's bite is not merely a physical act. It is a metaphorical penetration, a crossing of boundaries, and a confrontation with taboo desire. This fusion of horror and eroticism made him a vehicle for exploring repressed impulses, and it set a precedent for the modern erotic vampire archetype that, in literature and film, Dracula often embodies a duality. He is simultaneously alluring and terrifying. This juxtaposition allows for nuanced explorations of gender dynamics. Female characters are often placed in positions of vulnerability, fascination, and agency, reflecting the cultural tensions of their eras. Modern reinterpretations, however, frequently subvert these traditional roles. Characters inspired by Dracula, such as Anne Rice's Vampire Chronicles, display fluidity in sexual orientation and gender expression, challenging conventional norms and emphasizing consent, desire, and moral complexity. Here, Dracula's archetype becomes a mirror for evolving cultural attitudes towards sexuality, power, and identity. Morality is another axis upon which Dracula's influence pivots. The vampire's existence, immortal, predatory, and detached from human law, forces characters and audiences to confront ethical questions. Is Dracula evil by nature, or is he a product of circumstance? Should survival, hunger, and desire be judged against human moral frameworks? Contemporary narratives often explore these ambiguities, positioning Dracula-like figures as antiheroes or tragic monsters, whose moral choices are constrained by their unnatural condition. This lens encourages reflection on human morality, empathy, and the limits of judgment, elevating the vampire from a simple villain to a complex ethical and philosophical symbol. Furthermore, Dracula's narrative continues to intersect with cultural anxieties about disease, contagion, and societal collapse. The spread of vampirism has often been depicted as a metaphor for pandemics, corruption, or moral decay. This association, first subtly implied in Stoker's novel, has been amplified in modern media. Films like Let the Right One In and series such as Dracula on streaming platforms frame the vampire's bite as a vector for transformation, a reflection of fear around bodily autonomy, infection, and societal vulnerability. These stories highlight how Dracula and his descendants remain potent metaphors for both personal and collective anxieties, allowing the myth to remain relevant in times of crisis. Finally, Dracula's adaptability across genres ensures his enduring resonance. From gothic horror to psychological thriller, romance, and even comedy, the vampire mythos provides fertile ground for examining human nature. The character's presence in contemporary pop culture, through books, films, video games, and even fashion, demonstrates how his symbolic power evolves. He represents desire and fear, freedom and constraint, morality and transgression, all at once. This multiplicity allows Dracula to act as a cultural barometer, reflecting shifting attitudes towards sexuality, gender roles, ethics, and societal fears while remaining a timeless and universally recognized figure. Dracula's reach extends far beyond literature, embedding itself into global pop culture in ways that continually reshape his myth. The character has been adapted into countless films, each reflecting the social anxieties and aesthetic preferences of its era. The 1922 silent film Nosferatu, for instance, transformed the vampire into a grotesque, rat-like creature, emphasizing plague, death, and the terror of the outsider. Here, Dracula's aristocratic elegance is stripped away, replaced by the uncanny and alien, a visual embodiment of the fear of disease and foreign invasion that haunted post-World War I Europe. The by contrast, Bela Lugosi's 1931 portrayal reintroduced aristocratic sophistication, blending charm, menace, and sexuality. Lugosi's Dracula became iconic, cementing the image of the vampire as both refined and predatory. This version emphasized hypnotic presence, ritualistic movements, and a calm, controlled menace, a far cry from the grotesque horror of Nosferatu, yet equally terrifying in its psychological power. Christopher Lee's interpretation in the mid-20th century further shifted the vampire toward raw sexual energy and physical dominance, introducing the notion of overt eroticism and animalistic violence. Each iteration of Dracula reshapes the myth, reflecting the changing fears and fascinations of audiences, yet all trace back to Stoker's synthesis of historical, folkloric, and literary elements. The vampire's appeal is not limited to film. In television, literature, comics, and video games, Dracula serves as a template for exploring power, immortality, and morality. Modern reimaginings often blur lines between hero and villain, human and monster. And Rice's Vampire Chronicles present vampires as tragic, introspective, and morally complex, while series like Castlevania depict Dracula as a political and philosophical figure, a ruler whose choices are shaped by love, loss, and vengeance. In each medium, the core elements, aristocracy, supernatural power, seduction, and predatory menace, remain, yet they are adapted to fit contemporary narratives and cultural concerns. Dracula also functions as a symbol of otherness and transgression, allowing creators to explore identity, desire, and societal boundaries. His figure offers a canvas for examining fears of the foreign, the unknown, and the uncontrollable, as well as anxiety surrounding sexuality, gender, and morality. He embodies a paradox, both eternally threatening and endlessly fascinating, a monster whose presence forces confrontation with humanity's shadow self. This duality is why Dracula remains a cultural touchstone. He is a mirror reflecting both collective anxieties and individual desires, capable of evolving while retaining the essence of Stoker's original creation. Across the globe, the Dracula myth has been localized and transformed, taking on new symbolic meanings in diverse cultures. In Japan, vampire stories incorporate elements of samurai honor and spirit possession, blending local folklore with Western Gothic tropes. In Latin America, vampires intersect with indigenous myths about spirits and ancestral curses. These global adaptations demonstrate the vampire's versatility and enduring relevance. Dracula's archetype transcends its Victorian origins, showing how a mythic figure can be both historically rooted and culturally mutable, endlessly reinvented to suit new contexts while maintaining its core identity as predator, outsider, and symbol of fear and desire. Beyond his cinematic and literary legacy, Dracula also operates as a profound psychological symbol, representing the fears and desires that lie dormant within the human psyche. In Gothic literature, he embodies the tension between civilization and primal instinct, the struggle between reason and passion, order and chaos. His predatory presence disrupts domestic spaces, corrupting the familiar and the safe, and forcing characters and readers to confront the fragility of societal norms. The Victorian anxiety over sexuality, gender roles, and moral purity finds its most vivid expression in Dracula's interactions with women like Lucy Westerá and Mina Harker. Their transformations under his influence dramatize the tension between desire and repression, illustrating the dangers that Victorian society feared might emerge if the constraints of propriety were violated. Dracula's power also lies in his embodiment of the uncanny, the familiar made strange. He is human yet not human, noble yet monstrous, alluring yet repellent. Freud's concept of the uncanny resonates here, as the vampire evokes both fascination and terror precisely because he blurs the boundaries of identity, mortality, and moral law. The act of biting, so intimate and invasive, becomes a metaphor for psychological intrusion, for the ways that obsession, desire, or domination can consume the self. Every encounter with Dracula is thus a negotiation of power, a test of mental and emotional resilience, and a reflection of broader cultural anxieties. The vampire also embodies the tension between modernity and tradition. Stoker's London, teeming with new technologies, scientific progress, and imperial ambition, is infiltrated by an ancient, seemingly unstoppable force. Dracula represents the intrusion of history and superstition into the rational modern world, challenging the assumption that knowledge and science can fully control or explain reality. This is why the coalition of Harker, Van Helsing, Seward, Morris, and Mina is so important. They combine modern tools, typewriters, trains, blood transfusions, and systematic investigation, with traditional wisdom and faith. Their victories suggest that the balance between modernity and the past, science and superstition, is not only precarious but essential for survival. Moreover, Dracula's immortality and regenerative powers symbolize the persistence of fear itself. No matter how many times he is defeated, his image, his archetype, and his cultural power continue to resurface. He is not bound by linear time. He exists simultaneously as a historical figure, a literary creation, and a psychological entity. This multiplicity allows him to serve as a mirror for every generation's anxieties. The degeneration fears of the Victorian era, the existential crises of the 20th century, or contemporary concerns about disease, ecological collapse, and societal fragmentation. Dracula is, in essence, an evolving myth, one whose shape and meaning adapt to the cultural and historical moment, while maintaining a core of terror and fascination. His influence is also evident in the ways modern horror has developed narrative structures, tropes, and character archetypes. From vampire romances to urban horror, from psychological thrillers to cinematic monsters, the blueprint established by Stoker, combining historical illusion, folkloric realism, gothic atmosphere, and psychological insight, remains central. Every iteration of the vampire owes something to the careful construction of Dracula, whether through his aristocratic charisma, his supernatural abilities, or his symbolic resonance as an eternal outsider, a predator whose presence exposes hidden truths about human nature, society, and morality. That Dracula's transition from page to global icon began in the early decades of the 20th century, as adaptations transformed the literary monster into a visual and cultural phenomenon. Stage productions, beginning in the 1920s, simplified Stoker's sprawling narrative, condensing characters and plots, but in doing so emphasized the vampire's psychological and social allure. The aristocratic vampire became a figure of suspense and sophistication, a creature who could walk unnoticed among the living while exerting a subtle, almost hypnotic influence over them. This theatrical translation preserved the Gothic tension while making Dracula more immediately accessible to audiences unfamiliar with the novel's dense epistolary structure. The 1931 Universal Studios film solidified Dracula's iconic image. Bela Lugosi's performance gave the character a tangible presence that the written word could only hint at. Lugosi's deliberate movements, piercing gaze, and impeccable diction created a vampire who was not only menacing but compelling, a figure whose very poise suggested centuries of hidden knowledge and power. The visual shorthand established here, high collar, black cape, formal attire, controlled gestures, became synonymous with vampirism itself. For generations of viewers, this was the vampire, regardless of Stoker's more violent, warlord-inspired depiction. Lugosi emphasized the aristocratic and foreign aspects, playing into fears of the unknown and the exotic while simultaneously alluring and terrifying. The Hammer horror films of the 1950s and 1960s, particularly with Christopher Lee's portrayal, introduced another layer. Lee emphasized Dracula's raw physicality and sexuality, amplifying the threat of predation and desire. Here, the vampire was not just a foreign invader or a psychological symbol. He was a corporeal, sensuous force. The fusion of brute strength and aristocratic poise created a monster that could dominate a room with presence alone, reflecting both the Victorian fears of moral corruption and the mid-20th century fascination with the forbidden and the erotic. The brutality of these films also reminded audiences of the historical Vlad the Impaler, linking Stoker's abstraction to real-world savagery. Throughout the 20th and 21st centuries, Dracula has evolved, reflecting changing cultural anxieties. In literature, film, television, and graphic novels, he has been recast as a tragic hero, a romantic lover, a social predator, and a supernatural plague. Each reinterpretation emphasizes different elements: eroticism, aristocracy, monstrosity, or psychological manipulation. Yet beneath these adaptations lies Stoker's original synthesis, a monster who embodies fear, fascination, and the tension between ancient and modern forces. Dracula's ability to adapt while retaining his core essence is a testament to the care with which Stoker constructed him. The vampire's enduring power also comes from his role as a cultural mirror. He confronts societies with the consequences of hidden desires, social transgressions, and moral failures. Dracula's story dramatizes the invasion of the familiar by the unknown, the collapse of social and domestic order, and the persistence of primal fears beneath the veneer of civilization. This duality, between the seductively refined and the terrifyingly alien, ensures that Dracula remains relevant across contexts, allowing each generation to see its own anxieties reflected in his predatory gaze. In short, Dracula is more than a monster. He is a vessel, a symbol, and a narrative instrument. Stoker's genius lay not only in creating a terrifying character, but in constructing a flexible archetype capable of infinite reinvention. By blending historical reality, folklore, Gothic tradition, and psychological insight, he forged a monster whose influence extends far beyond literature into every facet of popular culture. Every vampire story that followed, whether faithful to Stoker or radically transformed, carries the echoes of Dracula's legacy, from the terror of predation to the allure of the forbidden, from the corruption of innocence to the triumph of reason and solidarity over ancient evil. As the 20th century progressed, Dracula became a lens through which societal fears and anxieties were projected. In the interwar period, the vampire often symbolized the fear of the foreign other, reflecting anxieties about immigration, urbanization, and social change. The aristocratic yet predatory vampire was a convenient embodiment of threats that were both sophisticated and incomprehensible, infiltrating homes and communities with subtle menace. The monster was no longer just a Gothic relic. He was a contemporary figure whose dangers mirrored political and social tensions of the time. During the Cold War, Dracula and other vampires were sometimes interpreted as allegories for ideological invasion. The vampire's ability to corrupt from within, to quietly dominate, and to impose unnatural order resonated with fears of espionage, subversion, and the invisible enemy. Horror narratives featuring vampires often emphasized secrecy, contagion, and the erosion of trust, all reflecting the pervasive cultural anxieties of that era. Even as Dracula's image retained its Gothic elegance, the stories surrounding him became infused with contemporary political resonance. In modern adaptations, the vampire has been increasingly humanized, sometimes romanticized, reflecting shifts in cultural values. Films, television shows, and novels often explore Dracula's emotional and psychological dimensions, presenting him as a tragic figure burdened by immortality and the moral consequences of his predation. This trend mirrors broader societal interest in understanding the villain rather than simply fearing them, a movement toward empathy, complexity, and moral ambiguity in storytelling. Even in horror-focused interpretations, Dracula is rarely a one-dimensional predator. His charisma, intellect, and vulnerability are as central to his allure as his violence. The vampire's cultural flexibility has allowed Dracula to persist across genres and media. In literature, he appears in retellings that merge historical fiction, romance, and philosophical inquiry. In cinema and television, his image ranges from terrifying to seductive, from aristocratic mastermind to primal predator. In video games, graphic novels, and interactive media, he becomes both antagonist and avatar, allowing audiences to confront, control, or even embody the monster. Each reinterpretation preserves core elements: immortality, predation, psychological manipulation, while emphasizing aspects relevant to the cultural moment. The Dracula's enduring presence highlights the interplay between horror and human psychology. He embodies the tensions between desire and fear, control and vulnerability, civilization and savagery. His story reminds us that monsters are reflections as much as threats, externalizing the fears, taboos, and moral dilemmas that societies may struggle to articulate. In confronting Dracula, audiences confront themselves, exploring the boundaries of morality, mortality, and human nature. Ultimately, Dracula's significance lies not only in his historical or literary origins, but in his capacity to evolve. He is a mirror of the human condition, adapting to the anxieties, desires, and moral questions of each era. The vampire endures because he is, simultaneously, both monster and mirror, a being whose fangs pierce not only flesh, but the deepest currents of cultural consciousness. Dracula's power is not only physical, but profoundly symbolic. Beyond representing foreign threats or social anxieties, he embodies the tension between life and death, desire and destruction, order and chaos. The vampire's immortality allows him to transcend human limitations, yet it also isolates him from the rhythms of mortal life. In this way, Dracula becomes a figure of existential dread, a being who experiences the world intensely but eternally, unable to participate fully in the human condition. His existence forces reflection on mortality, the passage of time, and the consequences of moral transgression. Sexuality is central to the vampire's enduring horror. Stoker's novel, while Victorian in tone, encodes potent erotic symbolism. The act of biting is simultaneously intimate and violent, a violation that creates both pleasure and terror. Victims are seduced into vulnerability, their life force drained, their boundaries transgressed. This interplay of seduction, dominance, and corporeal invasion reflects anxieties surrounding gender, desire, and social control. The vampire, particularly in the hands of Stoker and his literary predecessors, becomes a vehicle for exploring forbidden desires, same-sex attraction, erotic transgression, and the tension between repression and liberation. That Dracula's influence extends into modern psychology as well. Scholars have noted that the vampire myth externalizes internal conflicts, the struggle with one's darker impulses, the allure of power, and the fear of societal collapse. Dracula embodies the shadow self, the part of humanity capable of cruelty, desire, and moral compromise. The narrative of hunting and destroying the vampire parallels the psychological effort to confront and contain one's own destructive potential. In this sense, Dracula functions as both antagonist and teacher, a monstrous reflection that warns, challenges, and fascinates that in contemporary culture, Dracula is no longer confined to literature or film. He is a presence in video games, television series, and interactive storytelling, a character whose adaptability demonstrates the universal appeal of the archetype. Each iteration emphasizes different aspects: his aristocratic cunning, his erotic magnetism, his physical menace, or his tragic loneliness. The vampire continues to serve as a lens for exploring contemporary fears: pandemic disease, ecological collapse, authoritarian power, demonstrating the enduring flexibility of Stoker's creation. Dracula also illustrates the interplay between history, myth, and fiction. Stoker's meticulous research anchored the novel in a semblance of reality, yet he transformed historical sources and folklore into something far larger than life. By blending the real Vlad the Impaler, European superstition, and Gothic literary tradition, Stoker created a myth that could survive across centuries. The vampire is, therefore, not only a story but a cultural artifact, a vessel carrying the fears, hopes, and imaginations of generations. The continued fascination with Dracula testifies to the power of synthesis, of history, literature, psychology, and folklore. Each era projects its concerns onto him, yet the core remains, a being who is both predator and symbol, both foreign and intimately familiar, both a mirror and a warning. Stoker's genius lies in his creation of a figure who could adapt, who could be feared, desired, studied, and mythologized, ensuring that Dracula would never truly die. The evolution of Dracula in the 20th century demonstrates the remarkable elasticity of Stoker's creation. The stage adaptations of the 1920s and 1930s, though often simplifying the novel's complex narrative, amplified his theatrical presence. Actors emphasized mood, posture, and the hypnotic gaze, turning Dracula into a visual icon. The move from literature to performance transformed him from a carefully constructed intellectual and supernatural threat into an immediate, visceral experience. Audiences did not just read about terror. They witnessed it embodied on stage. The 1931 Universal Studios film starring Bela Lugosi crystallized Dracula's image in popular consciousness. Lugosi's performance, with his flowing cape, measured speech, and penetrating stare, created a shorthand for the vampire that would endure for decades. While Stoker's Count was a combination of physical prowess, intelligence, and supernatural menace, Lugosi's portrayal emphasized charisma and hypnotic power. This shift reflects the broader cultural desire to make horror both intimate and alluring. Fear intertwined with fascination. Subsequent cinematic interpretations, particularly the Hammer horror films starring Christopher Lee in the 1950s and 1960s, further expanded the vampire's persona. Lee's Dracula was physically imposing, brutally violent, and overtly sexual, contrasting with Lugosi's subtle menace. These films foreground the eroticism inherent in the myth, emphasizing predatory desire alongside supernatural threat. The interplay of blood, beauty, and brutality resonated with audiences, cementing the vampire as a symbol of transgressive sexuality and power. Dracula's adaptability is also evident in literature. Writers from Anne Rice to Stephen King have reimagined the vampire in ways that reflect contemporary anxieties. Rice's vampires explore existential longing and ethical complexity. King's incorporate psychological horror rooted in modern American society. Despite these variations, each draws on Stoker's foundational architecture, the noble, intelligent, predatory being whose power challenges societal norms and human limits. The vampire's ability to embody multiple fears ensures its persistence in the cultural imagination. Modern media extends this adaptability even further. Television series, video games, and graphic novels present Dracula in new contexts, urban dystopias, digital landscapes, alternate histories, while retaining essential elements of his mythology. He becomes simultaneously a villain, an antihero, and a cultural touchstone, demonstrating the flexibility of a narrative constructed with historical resonance, folkloric grounding, and Gothic sophistication. Beyond entertainment, Dracula's influence extends into psychology, sociology, and cultural studies. The vampire functions as a lens to examine power dynamics, moral transgression, and human desire. Dracula embodies fears of invasion, contamination, and loss of control, but he also represents the allure of power and eternal life. Each adaptation, each retelling, negotiates these dualities, reflecting both the era's collective anxieties and individual psychological preoccupations. At its core, Dracula endures because he is fundamentally a mirror. Stoker's synthesis of historical cruelty, folkloric superstition, and Gothic imagination created a figure capable of reflecting multiple layers of human fear and fascination. Each generation sees in Dracula the threats and desires most relevant to its own context. For the Victorians, he was the foreign invader, the corrupter of women, the embodiment of degenerate heredity. For the modern audience, he might be a metaphor for pandemic, environmental collapse, or systemic exploitation. The myth persists because it is never fixed. It evolves alongside humanity's own evolving anxieties. Stoker's genius lies in this careful construction. By drawing from history, folklore, and prior literature, he created a monster who is both singular and endlessly malleable. Dracula is not merely a fictional creation. He is a living myth, a cultural and psychological artifact that transcends time. His immortality mirrors the fears he embodies. Just as he cannot die, neither can the anxieties, desires, and moral questions he represents. In this way, the vampire is eternal, not merely because of fangs or blood, but because of the enduring power of the stories, symbols, and fears he channels that in contemporary culture. Dracula operates not only as a figure of horror, but as a prism through which societal anxieties and personal fears are refracted. Modern narratives explore dimensions that Stoker could only hint at: identity, morality, and existential crisis. The vampire's immortality forces a confrontation with time itself, a mirror to human mortality and the inevitability of decay. Stories such as those in and Rice's The Vampire Chronicles, or the reinterpretations in shows like Castlevania present vampires not merely as predators, but as beings grappling with selfhood, memory, and conscience. Here, Dracula evolves into a tragic figure whose horror is entwined with his isolation and eternal yearning. Video games and interactive media expand this dynamic further, allowing audiences to inhabit the vampire's perspective. In games like Vampire, The Masquerade, Bloodlines, players explore moral ambiguity, political intrigue, and the seductive power of supernatural authority. The agency granted to the player transforms Dracula and his mythos from distant object of fear into a role that can be examined, questioned, or even sympathized with. This shift in medium reflects the broader cultural trend. Audiences no longer consume horror passively. They interact with it, interrogate it, and shape it themselves. That Dracula's iconography, cape, fangs, hypnotic gaze, remains central, but these visual cues are increasingly layered with symbolic meaning. The vampire's predation becomes a metaphor for systemic oppression, societal exploitation, or the predatory nature of certain human desires. Scholars in cultural studies note that the vampire reflects anxieties about boundaries between life and death, native and foreign, self and other. As a result, Dracula's mythology is not fixed. It is a living narrative, continually rewritten to address shifting fears and fascinations. Interestingly, Dracula's narrative is not merely externalized. It intersects with internal, psychological narratives. Psychoanalytic interpretations suggest that vampires embody the repressed aspects of human consciousness, the desires, fears, and impulses society seeks to control. Dracula's bite, then, is symbolic of temptation and the confrontation with forbidden urges. The struggle between hunter and hunted becomes a struggle within the self. Morality versus desire, order versus chaos. In this way, the vampire myth operates on both cultural and individual levels simultaneously, offering a rich, multi-layered narrative experience. Moreover, Dracula's adaptability has allowed him to traverse genres beyond horror. He appears in romance, comedy, and political allegory, sometimes simultaneously embodying terror and allure. This versatility underscores the robustness of Stoker's original construction. The character is sufficiently complex to support both fear and fascination, horror and empathy. Each reinvention adds a new layer to the mythos, ensuring relevance to contemporary audiences while maintaining continuity with the Gothic tradition. The global proliferation of Dracula narratives also highlights cultural translation and reinterpretation. In Japan, adaptations such as Hellsing or manga versions integrate local folklore, aesthetics, and narrative conventions, producing a hybrid figure that resonates within a distinct cultural context. Similarly, in Latin America, vampire stories incorporate indigenous mythologies, colonial histories, and contemporary social issues, demonstrating how the Dracula archetype can be adapted to express region-specific anxieties. This global circulation reinforces the notion that Dracula is not merely a British Gothic invention, but a universal symbol capable of infinite reinvention. Dracula's enduring popularity also reflects changing technologies of storytelling. Cinematic special effects, computer-generated imagery, and immersive media allow for new forms of spectacle, while social media, fan fiction, and virtual reality enable participatory storytelling. In this way, the narrative evolves not only in content, but in form, reflecting the ways audiences engage with myth in a digital age. The vampire myth becomes interactive, dynamic, and culturally pervasive, illustrating the remarkable resilience of Stoker's creation. At its core, the Dracula narrative thrives because it accommodates complexity, fear intermingled with desire, morality entwined with transgression, human vulnerability juxtaposed with supernatural power. Each adaptation, literary, cinematic, or interactive, emphasizes different facets, but the underlying tensions remain consistent. Dracula is more than a monster. He is a lens through which we examine the boundaries of our humanity, the nature of our fears, and the allure of the forbidden. In the 21st century, Dracula's relevance extends beyond traditional horror into explorations of identity, sexuality, and power. Contemporary narratives often cast him as an outsider, navigating societies that fear and ostracize him, making his mythos resonate with themes of marginalization and otherness. For instance, LGBTQ+ readings of vampire stories highlight the subversive potential of the vampire figure, where the act of feeding or transforming another person symbolizes forbidden desire, transgression, and liberation from societal norms. This interpretive layer transforms Dracula from a simple predator into a complex figure negotiating consent, agency, and identity in worlds that restrict his nature. Digital culture has further amplified Dracula's symbolic versatility. Social media platforms, fan communities, and virtual storytelling spaces allow audiences to remix and reinterpret the myth. TikTok, for example, features micronarratives and character-driven performances where Dracula is humorous, romantic, or philosophical rather than purely terrifying. Memes and fan art explore Dracula's emotional depth, his loneliness, and even mundane struggles, humanizing him while maintaining the mythic aura. In essence, the figure becomes a mirror reflecting contemporary anxieties and fantasies, evolving in real time alongside cultural shifts. Video games continue to expand the vampire archetype. Titles like Castlevania, Lords of Shadow, and Bloodstained, Ritual of the Night integrate moral choice, strategic combat, and complex lore, inviting players to navigate ethical dilemmas as vampires. Here, the vampire's immortality serves as both power and burden, offering insight into themes of isolation, memory, and the human craving for legacy. Players are prompted to question the nature of justice, revenge, and morality from the perspective of a creature that exists outside conventional human boundaries. Dracula also functions as a political allegory. The vampire's predatory intrusion into human society parallels critiques of exploitation, colonialism, and systemic oppression. Historical readings of Stoker's original text suggest that Dracula embodies anxieties about foreign influence, contagion, and social upheaval. Modern interpretations extend these metaphors to economic, environmental, and technological concerns, illustrating the adaptability of the myth to address contemporary global issues. By personifying both the threat and allure of power, Dracula remains a potent symbol of social critique. Cinematically, Dracula has transformed from a Gothic horror icon into a figure of psychological and aesthetic fascination. Filmmakers explore the interplay between fear and beauty, darkness and desire. In productions like Dracula Untold, the character's moral ambiguity and personal tragedy are foreground, creating a narrative that merges epic fantasy with intimate human emotion. Costume, cinematography, and special effects work together to render Dracula simultaneously terrifying, sympathetic, and visually iconic. These choices reinforce the myth's dual appeal as horror and as a study of complex human emotion. Furthermore, Dracula's interactions with other supernatural beings, werewolves, witches, ghosts, expand his mythic ecosystem, creating intricate narrative networks. Shared universes, crossovers, and spin-offs, whether in comics, games, or television, allow the exploration of relational dynamics among immortal beings. Dracula's character becomes a node in a web of mythology, where alliances, rivalries, and histories create expansive narrative possibilities. This intertextuality reinforces his adaptability and enduring cultural presence, allowing each generation to explore new ethical, emotional, and existential dilemmas through his story. From a psychological perspective, Dracula embodies the tension between instinct and intellect, passion and control. His thirst is never just literal. It represents a hunger for connection, power, or understanding that transcends human limits. Contemporary adaptations often delve into his internal struggles, guilt, desire, alienation, inviting audiences to empathize with the monster. This shift from external horror to internal conflict reflects broader cultural trends, emphasizing character depth over simple shock value. In this way, Dracula evolves into a tragic figure whose monstrosity is inseparable from his humanity. Ultimately, Dracula endures because he is a mirror of humanity's own contradictions, our fear of death, our fascination with power, and our longing for connection. He exists at the intersection of horror and desire, morality and transgression, isolation and intimacy. Each generation reinvents him, projecting its own anxieties, fantasies, and ethical dilemmas onto his figure. Whether as a gothic villain, a tragic antihero, a romantic icon, or a meme, Dracula's myth remains flexible, resonant, and deeply human. In the end, the vampire does not simply haunt the night. He haunts the imagination, reminding us that our own shadows, fears, and desires are never far behind. Dracula's legacy is not confined to the page, the screen, or the stage. He thrives in the conversations we have, the stories we tell, and the art we create. His immortality is not just in fiction. It is in cultural memory, in the ways we continually reinterpret what it means to be human, to crave, to fear, and to transcend. In every retelling, Dracula persists, not just as a monster, but as a lens through which we examine ourselves. He is, in essence, eternal because the questions he embodies about life, death, desire, and morality are eternal too. And so, the story of Dracula closes not with an ending, but with a reflection that the monster, the outsider, and the immortal will continue to walk through literature, film, games, and imagination, forever entwined with the fears, hopes, and dreams of those who dare to look into the darkness and see themselves.